Oh, sorry, you startled me. Do you guys know that Christianity is true? And I don't mean just like, yeah, it's this thing that I say that's true. No, it is actually true. Evidentially, historically, it's true. Christianity is true. You know, that's something I say a lot on this channel, by the way. Christianity is true. But in today's video, today's very, very long video, we're going to actually prove it. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and the video that you're about to watch features an in-depth discussion between myself and two experts on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, this was actually recorded originally as like a 5-part series for our podcast, but I decided to go ahead and string all of them together so you guys could listen without any breaks in between them. And so the total amount of time, I think, is around 3.5 hours, if you can believe it. It's a long time. We cover a lot of ground in this interview, so please take your time with it. I think you're going to really enjoy it. For links to the Capturing Christianity podcast for other podcast episodes, check the link in the description. Also, another quick reminder that I support my wife and 2 young children through this ministry, so if you find the work that I do valuable, please consider supporting me on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Capturing Christianity. All right, I'm not going to take up any more of your time. Here is my 3+ hour long interview with Dr. Calum Miller and Dr. Max Baker-Hytch on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Capturing Christianity. Today we have a really awesome podcast planned on the evidence, the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. And I'm joined by 2 guests. One of them has been on the show before, Calum Miller, Dr. Calum Miller. Doctor, not in just the sense that he's got a PhD and stuff, but he also is actually a medical doctor. And so if you want to learn more about him, I'm just going to give him a little brief intro at the outset here. But if you want to learn more about him, we recorded a 2-part series on the prior probability of the resurrection. So go back and listen to that. We get a lot more into his background, some of the stuff that he's done, debates and all that good stuff. So go back and listen to those 2 parts if you want to learn more about him. But Calum, why don't you go ahead and jump on, just refresh everybody who you are, what you do, and why you're interested in philosophy of religion, this question about Jesus' resurrection.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, like you said, I work as a medical doctor part-time, and the rest of the time I do a mix of things. I do some research on philosophy, some research on biblical studies, some research on bioethics, and a bit of teaching at the university here in Oxford. And I work with the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics here with Max, where we do a variety of things. Some of it is mission work, some of it is speaking and doing talks and training and teaching. And then we also train a load of students each year to go out and be evangelists who are equipped with the kind of academic, the evidence for Christianity, ways we can communicate that better. And so we're both involved in that as well.
One thing we didn't talk about last time was the fact that you're really active in the abortion debate.
Yeah, so having been to medical school, that is kind of where my interest in that started. And I just found learning about it at medical school and then discussing the ethics in an academic context, as well as seeing the reality of it, that was something that just struck me as really important, especially I think because in the UK, we just don't have the same sort of debate about it that you would in America. Even the church basically never really wants to speak about it or address it as an issue. And so I thought I could really hopefully make a difference by speaking about it in England and trying to make things better in that respect and get the church involved and get people talking about it as a topic to, I think, stop the harm that it causes to women and children. So that's something that I've always found really interesting and just had a passion for.
What have you done in regards to like written material on your blog? I know that you have a couple articles on it, but if you were to send someone to go look more into what you've done, the work that you've done on abortion, where is like the first place that you would send someone?
So pretty much everything I've done on that topic is on my website, which is calumsblog.com. Some of it will be in the academic papers section. So there's a section just at the top called academic papers, and the work that I've published in journals will be on there. And then other work that's just a few blog posts or things about what Jesus would have said or the early church, and a huge handout that covers kind of everything to do with the ethics and the policy and the law and the healthcare aspects of abortion. All those sorts of things are in this big handout that I've put on the bioethics section of my website. So do feel free to check that out as well.
Awesome. We'll definitely have to have you back on to talk about that. We've done a post on our website, two powerful arguments against abortion, and we actually cited one of the ones that we found on your website. So yeah, we'll have to do that sometime in the future. But Max, you're new to the show, so tell everyone, what should we know about you, Max? And first of all, how do you pronounce your last name?
It's Baker-Hytch.
Baker-Hytch. Okay. I just tried to do your accent. Baker-Hytch. Okay. Awesome.
Right.
So what should we know about you, Max?
I'm a lecturer in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall, which is part of the University of Oxford. So I did my PhD in philosophy at Oxford, finished in 2014. And since then, I did a couple of what are known as postdoctoral fellowships, which are basically kind of early career academic positions where you get to spend a lot of time doing research and writing academic papers. So yeah, one of those was in the United States at Notre Dame. And so I've been back in Oxford now for 2 years. So I have a kind of hybrid, or essentially I have two jobs actually. So like I said, I'm a lecturer at Wycliffe, which is part of the university. But then I'm also one of the academic lecturers at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, which Calum sort of said a little bit about. Yeah, I mean, in terms of my kind of faith journey, I suppose, I haven't always been a Christian. Perhaps a bit like Calum, I grew up in a loosely Christian household. So was certainly exposed to Christianity when I was younger, but by teenage years, I was fairly kind of apathetic and agnostic. And it was really through kind of meeting Christians in my first year as an undergraduate at university and starting to take seriously the idea that there actually might be kind of reasons and arguments for thinking that Christianity is true that I became a Christian. So that would be now about 10, 11 years ago.
Well, thanks both of you for coming back onto the podcast. Calum especially for coming back on, and then Max, your first time on the show. It's great to have you guys here. I had this initial question as we were getting into talking about the evidence for the resurrection, and that is, were either of you, as you were on your journey, your faith journey, were you surprised at all by the strength of the evidence for the resurrection?
I think I was, in the sense that I didn't really think about it before I looked at the historical evidence. So I had these kind of weird views and quite rapidly changing views about religion growing up as a teenager. I probably most of the time believed in God, but not all the time. And then I would just kind of like, I didn't really have a kind of evidential framework for thinking about these things. No one had ever explained to me that your views on this topic should be based on evidence, whether Christian or non-Christian or anything like that. So I just kind of picked the views that seemed nice. So I liked some ideas in Sikhism, I liked some ideas in Unitarianism, that sort of thing. And then it was only when I really kind of looked into the historical evidence for the resurrection in particular that I began to take seriously this kind of idea of Christianity as God coming to earth as Jesus and revealing himself kind of primarily and exclusively through that. And in that sense, I had no idea what the historical evidence for the resurrection was. So to read about it then was really, really surprising and really changed how I thought about things and how I looked at religion and how I looked at God. So that was really, really surprising for me. And then obviously when you come to this kind of perspective, you look at the counter evidence and you spend the next few years thinking, well, is this right? Maybe there are some good counter arguments. And so I've spent the years since looking into it from a historical perspective. I did this master's in biblical studies. I looked at it from a kind of psychiatric and medical perspective. And just looking at it from these views and looking at it in real detail just confirmed to me, I think, that the evidence is really, really surprisingly strong. And I haven't really met anything in the meantime to undermine that, I don't think.
So same question to you, Max. Was there in your faith journey, was there anything you came across that was surprising in regard to the evidence for the resurrection?
Yeah, I think so. In that, I guess, I knew about these claims that Jesus was raised from the dead because I went to Sunday school when I was younger. But I suppose I always had assumed that, much like the sort of central claims of other major religions, that this would just be something that one kind of would either accept on faith or just reject, and that there wasn't much more to it than that. And so, yeah, I was genuinely surprised when I started learning about the way in which we have some, very early sources attesting what appears to be a very sincere conviction by Jesus' followers. And obviously we're going to go into all of that later. And actually, but not just the evidence for the resurrection, but also the evidence for just how early it was in the Christian movement. Essentially, as far as we can tell from the very earliest stage of the Christian movement, they were saying the most astounding things about Jesus and his status in relation to God, and seemingly kind of worshipping him and giving him titles that only belong to God in the minds of ancient Jews. But I think I also wanted to put a little bit of a qualifier in there, which is that, yeah, I definitely, when you think about the evidence for the resurrection in comparison to the evidence for the central claims of other religions, for instance, that, the Quran was a perfect divine text sent down from heaven to Muhammad, I think the evidence for the resurrection is just orders of magnitude stronger. And at the same time, I've kind of gone back and forth a bit on just how strong the evidence for the resurrection is. And probably my current position is that the evidence for the resurrection is pretty good, the direct historical evidence, but that I also think that if there were strong arguments for there being a very low prior probability that God raised Jesus from the dead, I'm not convinced, at least at this point in time, that the direct historical evidence about the tomb and the appearances would be strong enough to overcome a very low prior probability. So I do think that the case for the resurrection has to also involve a case for theism more generally, and a case for thinking that God would want to raise this person from the dead. It's not just enough to talk about, the minimal facts sort of case for the resurrection, these 5 facts or however many you want to include concerning what happened after Jesus' death. I think you have to situate it in a broader context. Or another way to put it would be that if we had the same kind of evidence concerning an empty grave and post-mortem appearances to some random person in antiquity, same strength of evidence, I probably wouldn't be inclined to think that person had been raised. So yeah, I think that it does require a kind of a significant background of evidence.
That's really interesting, because in our podcast, Calum, you were saying that you think the strength of the evidence is very strong, right? That it could overcome even a really low prior probability.
Yeah, so Max and I probably disagree slightly on this. I mean, I think it's, in a sense, if the prior probability is low enough, then no amount of evidence in a way would overcome it. Or for any set amount of evidence, even if it's really, really strong, if you set the prior probability sufficiently low, then the resurrection isn't going to be probable overall. So in a sense, it's sort of trivially true that you need the prior probability to be at least something, depending on how strong the evidence is. And in a sense, how to quantify the strength of the evidence can be a little bit difficult, especially when you get into such enormous numbers as you kind of get with miracle claims and the evidence for them. So in theory, I kind of, I agree that you need some kind of decent prior probability. But I think, firstly, the prior probability is pretty good, so that actually the direct evidence for the historical claims doesn't actually need to be that strong. But I think Max and I would both agree that the direct historical evidence is still strong. I would say even stronger than Max would, but both of us would, I think, agree that it would be good evidence, and certainly enough to make people think, actually, could this be true? Could Jesus have risen from the dead? Could he be who he said he was? And certainly I think it's difficult, even if not impossible, to come up with naturalistic explanations.
So we're about to jump into the evidence, but before we do that, I just want to talk a little about some of the resources you found while researching this topic? Do any stand out? Are there any that maybe aren't as popular that you definitely recommend that people get their hands on and read?
So yeah, I think that one book that's a pretty short book and a fairly accessible way into the historical evidence is The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Michael Licona and Gary Habermas. I would say similarly kind of accessible is William Lane Craig's The Sun Rises. My favorite books on the resurrection, like that are from a more philosophical perspective, would definitely be Richard Swinburne's book, The Resurrection of God Incarnate, which, I think does a great job of doing just what I was talking about earlier in terms of situating the direct historical evidence against a broader backdrop of evidence regarding kind of, is there likely to be a God who would raise Jesus from the dead? I've also just actually read Dale Allison's book, Resurrecting Jesus, which I quite like just because I think he does a really fair job of evaluating the historical evidence, and because he is sort of quite skeptical in a way. Like, he definitely doesn't sort of think that the Gospels are like highly reliable sources, but he nonetheless comes to the conclusion that like the burial and the empty tomb are probably historical. Yeah, in terms of the way he sort of evaluates the strength of the evidence, he has some quite intriguing discussions of sort of modern day reports of apparitions of the recently deceased, which some of which he actually takes quite seriously as being possibly veridical, and which he actually thinks can increase the plausibility of some of the details in the detailed resurrection narratives in the Gospels.
Yeah, I guess I'd add a couple. So one that I really like is Jesus, the Final Days by Craig Evans and Tom Wright. I think it is a really, really short book that usually, I think, adds novel stuff that most people who are familiar with his literature haven't really looked into before. So Craig Evans has a really good chapter on the death of Jesus and the burial of Jesus, which is really, really quite compelling, I think. And then Tom Wright just has a really short but good chapter on the evidence for the resurrection itself. In addition to that, I would say Tim and Lydia McGrew's article in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology is always worth reading. Has a good section on the philosophy and a good section on the historical evidence and how powerful it can be.
That one's actually available online for free too, if you just search for it.
I didn't know that. So there you go.
Yeah, I think Lydia has it on her website.
Okay, yeah. And the other one is not so much on the well, there are some that are not quite on the resurrection, but on the reliability of the New Testament more generally. And my favorites of those at the moment will probably be things like Jesus Under Fire by Wilkins and Moreland and Fabricating Jesus by Craig Evans I really liked. But there are tons more books on that we could recommend. So it would probably be dangerous to get into that territory.
Yeah, it would. We need to get into talking about the evidence. And we have one last thing to talk about. Well, really two. But are there any qualifications or things to keep in mind as we go along, as we're talking about the evidence? I think one of them is that we need to remember that the Bible, like, we don't have to think of the documents as inspired when we're talking about the historical evidence. I think that's one thing to keep in mind. But are there any others that you guys suggest that we just keep in our brains as we're moving along through this evidence?
Yeah, I think one thing that's often, comes as a shock to people who haven't been exposed to the study of ancient history before is just that it's actually very normal in the study of ancient history for a source which is regarded as very reliable by professional historians to have been written several decades after the events that it recounts. So I think sometimes in sort of more popular level online expressions of skepticism about the resurrection or just the Gospels more generally, you have people demanding sources that were written at the time of the events, which is understandable from the point of view of modern day expectations, when obviously like we have newspapers that are written the next day about events. But actually in the ancient world, most people couldn't read and write, and And also people had to be much more proficient at retaining information without being able to write it down. And so ancient historians are unfazed by having to deal with sources that are written from our point of view a long time after the events. And actually, when you have in mind the perspective that some of the best sources for the ancient world, so like Tacitus's Annals of Imperial Rome, written in the early 2nd century about a lot of events in the 1st century. So some of the events Tacitus writes about happened, 80 years before Tacitus was writing, and yet professional historians today think that he's a very good source. And when you have that perspective, then you see actually that the time gaps between the sources about Jesus and the events are actually compare very favorably, especially when we take into account, and we'll discuss this more obviously, some of these sort of oral summaries that we find embedded in Paul's letters, particularly, seem to go back to within like years or even months of the events. Then that actually is very a very kind of nice situation to be in for an ancient historian.
And Calum, what about you?
Yeah, I guess along similar lines, there are a number of clarifications you can make and lots of things you can say about the philosophy of history and general standards of ancient history. But I think one thing that struck me similar to what Max was saying is how many sources we normally have for history. And you get a lot of skeptics sometimes saying, oh, well, these things in the Bible aren't always confirmed by external sources, even though, a lot of the main outline of Jesus' ministry is confirmed by external sources. Much of it isn't. And much of it is written only by Christians. And some skeptics seem to think that this is significant historically. But in fact, if you look at ancient history and you look at some of the major figures in ancient history, so some of the much more famous people at Jesus' time, like the Herodian family, the majority of them are only mentioned by Josephus or in coins. And there's really not much kind of biographical information that we have about some of these really prominent figures. We don't have a huge amount of biographical information about Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea at the time, apart from a few stories in Josephus and a couple of other sources. So when you think what the general kind of situation is in ancient history with respect to really quite famous figures, and then you find out that when it comes to Jesus, we have not just a reasonably wide variety of non-Christian sources, but also at least 4 or so Christian sources, we actually have an enormous wealth of data about Jesus that is actually really, really surprising by the standards of ancient history. And when it comes to looking at the Christian sources in particular, often people, I suppose, dismiss them because they're written by followers of Jesus. And I guess in short, this just doesn't really make sense historically. So much of history is written by people who were sympathetic to the events they're describing or the people they're describing. And of course, at times that can lead to inaccuracies or it can lead to inflating certain claims or things like that in ancient history. But in general, historians are perfectly confident to trust the bulk of what they say, the main gist of what they say. And they're fairly confident that they can identify when these claims have been inflated, and they're fairly confident they can identify the effects of bias. And what's interesting is when you look at the Christian accounts, we can actually look at these kind of indicators of bias and where bias would have led the authors and actually show that the bias really doesn't affect their history taking very much if you look at it in detail. So I think that would be one of the main clarifications I'd make as well, is that the Christian sources are still valuable from a historical perspective, and virtually every historian on the planet would take the gospel seriously as history, even if they have quite varying views about just how reliable they are.
Now, obviously, we're talking about one event in history, or one big event, the resurrection of Jesus. When we're thinking about any kind of historical event, there's this question of like, okay, so how far back do we go? When do we actually start looking at like what kind of historical evidence is relevant to this event? How far back do we go? So like, do we start, when we're talking about the resurrection, do we start at the birth of Jesus? Do we start at the crucifixion? Where do you guys think that is most important to start when we're discussing this event, the resurrection of Jesus?
Well, as I said earlier, I think that the full case for the resurrection is radically incomplete without a discussion of whether there's any reason to think that this particular person is likely to be the sort of person whom a good God would raise from the dead. And so, given that, then that inclines me to think that we can't just talk about what happened from Jesus' crucifixion onwards. We do have to back up a bit. I suppose that I would say, the most relevant place to begin is Jesus' public ministry, because if we want to find out about whether Jesus was the sort of person that God would raise from the dead, if there is a God, we need to try and ascertain what we can about the kinds of things he was doing in public, the kinds of things he was saying about himself, the kinds of things he was teaching others, and so on. And so, so I think that's why the study of the historical Jesus more broadly, which really is kind of the study of Jesus' ministry, since we don't really have anything very concrete at all about Jesus' life prior to that, except for some very minimal details about where he came from and who his parents were and so on. I would say his historical ministry.
Well, let's get into it. So where do you guys want to begin with the evidence for the resurrection?
So I like to begin talking about the resurrection by looking at what the non-Christian sources say. Not because I necessarily think that they're more valuable historically, but just as a kind of gentle way in to show that even if you are really skeptical of the Christian sources and you think they can't possibly be talking about history, they must just be inventing it all. Actually, the non-Christian sources, I think, situate it and ground it in first century Israel, and they give us a basic historical backbone that the Gospels just fill in the details for and complete in a more precise way. And so I like to talk about what Josephus says, what Tacitus says, and people like that, just to show that actually the fundamental outline of what the Christian story said is historically fairly unassailable, I think. And then you can use the Gospels to fill in other details as well as that.
Max, same kind of question. For something like the crucifixion, is that what you go to as well, as like looking at the non-Christian sources? Or is this more like a tactic? It seems, Calum, you're thinking like a tactic more in terms of like rhetoric or being convincing, persuasive to somebody, a skeptic who's not really convinced of the resurrection. Starting at the non-Christian sources seems like, okay, these guys are like not biased. A lot of skeptics online will say, well, we can't trust the Christian authors because they're biased.
Right. Well, so I mean, I think I would agree with what Calum said, that that doesn't really make much sense as a general approach to doing history. And if one did take that approach more generally, we wouldn't be able to know very much about history, given how much of it has been written from the perspective of people who are sympathetic to the events and people in question. But yeah, I think rhetorically it is, can be powerful to start with the non-Christian sources. I would stress also that I think actually we would still have every reason to believe that Jesus was crucified, even if we only had the Christian sources, because after all, we don't just have the gospel sources, where, if you're going to divide those up in the way that mainstream scholarship does, you'd probably say, Mark is one source, Q is another source, although Q doesn't really talk about the crucifixion of Jesus. And then Matthew and Luke clearly have their own extra material, and there's some reason to think that certainly Luke has independent access to the passion story of Jesus, and then John is very plausibly an independent source once again. But not only do we have those gospel sources from within 3, 4, 5 decades of the events, but we also have Paul's letters, and Paul unquestionably knew some of the major eyewitnesses, and was writing at a time when those eyewitnesses were still alive, and Paul had clearly received information from them about the circumstances surrounding Jesus' death. So yeah, all that to say, even if we had no non-Christian sources, we would still have every reason to believe that Jesus' crucifixion was a real event.
Normally what happens in these conversations about, well, really, so like Christian apologists, Christian thinkers, whatever you want to call them, philosophers, when they're defending the resurrection of Jesus, normally what happens is they'll list like four to five, 4 to 6, maybe even like up to 12 different facts that they go about establishing historically, like the crucifixion, the burial, the empty tomb of Jesus, and the fact that he appeared to several people after his death, or that at least people experienced that. So what normally happens is that like they'll go through this list of like establishing this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And then from there they ask, okay, well, what's the explanation of all these facts that we can ascertain through history? Is this the approach that you two take in thinking about the evidence for the resurrection, or do you go about it some other way or method?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, establishing kind of the basic fact is one of the most useful and easily categorized ways to go about it. And certainly I think that's probably the best way to do it. I guess I was just kind of going with the non-Christian sources to begin with, just to kind of ground it in history. So just to give an overall sense of what the Christian story says and to show that the Gospels fill in a lot of the details. So, for example, we know from non-Christian sources alone, from people like Josephus and Tacitus and Pliny and Suetonius, we know that Jesus was a wise man. He worked miracles. He was called the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. Multiple non-Christian sources say that. But also he was prayed to as a god or worshipped as a god. We know Christians met on a fixed day, which we think is likely the Sunday, which is interesting for reasons we'll get into in a little while. We know that Christianity spread widely in large numbers across the Roman Empire. We know that Christians were widely persecuted. Again, this is in multiple of those Roman sources. We know it from Pliny. We know it from Trajan. We know it from Tacitus and Suetonius. And we know from Josephus that specific people like James, Jesus' brother, was executed. But also one really interesting thing, in addition to the kind of fixed day that Pliny records, where we think Christians began to worship, particularly on the Sunday, Tacitus also mentions that the movement stopped briefly after Jesus' death. So he says that after Jesus' execution under Pontius Pilate in the reign of Emperor Tiberius, the movement stopped, but then it broke out again in Judea specifically, before spreading to Rome. And so, although it confirms general details about Jesus' life and the kind of person he was seen as and what early Christians believed, we also know from the non-Christian sources alone that after Jesus' crucifixion, the movement kind of stopped for a little bit. And then shortly afterwards in Judea, i.e. where Jerusalem is, the movement started again. And it started again in such a way that they began to worship on a Sunday, and it spread widely among Greeks and Jews. They were widely persecuted and they began to see Jesus as a god, and they still called him the Messiah even after this shameful execution. And so I think just setting that background gives kind of the basic gist of the history and sets the scene historically and shows that pretty much all of this is historically uncontroversial, even if you don't look at the Bible, even if you completely ignore the Christian sources. The main bulk of the case is already set in stone historically. And then you can go to the individual facts like the crucifixion, the burial, the empty tomb, the appearances, and you can just build up the evidence from there. But we already know enough from the non-Christian sources alone to say that actually these things are fairly historically likely. They're pretty much certain in the case of the crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. We know the movement stopped for a little while. And then given that the Christians began to talk about Jesus' resurrection, and given what the word resurrection meant in that culture, it seems likely that they could only have done so if they had thought they'd seen Jesus and if his tomb was found empty. So I think we can give a reasonable historical case for those kind of data from the non-Christian sources alone. But then we can go into each individual bit of that kind of story and pile on the extra evidence. So that might be what we can do next.
Yeah, I wanted to do that actually. But first I wanted to ask Max if you agreed with everything Calum said, or is there any parts that you would disagree about? So like he's wanting to build this case from the non-Christian sources first to establish the broad outlines of like the resurrection. There's this crucifixion, burial, the tomb was found empty, and it must have done so because what resurrection meant back in the day. So is that, do you agree with that method, that process?
Yeah, I mean, broadly, I think that's absolutely right. And just as a general historical method, trying to first sort of establish our broad historical backdrop before we start plugging in more specific details completely makes sense. And yeah, that's right. I mean, we clearly do have, attested, quite widely in non-Christian sources that Jesus, was seen as a teacher. Josephus, as Calum said, alludes to his reputation for working miracles, and that his followers believed he was the Messiah. And then, the circumstances surrounding his crucifixion are there too. I suppose, I think, obviously, I mean, I think Calum would probably agree. I think there's a limit to how far this can take you in terms of establishing, what exactly caused this movement to mushroom after the crucifixion of their leader. I mean, there isn't an unambiguous reference to belief in Jesus' resurrection in those early non-Christian sources. So Josephus may possibly reference that his followers believed they saw him on that he appeared to them on the third day. Possibly. Tacitus says, that the movement stopped and broke out again, and obviously that's intriguing, and that leads us to ask why that happened. And I think it leads us to think you're certainly going to have to posit something quite significant happening. I just don't think it can get you that far in terms of oh, it must have been these polymodal, very concrete kind of post-mortem appearances that would have done it. Just again, because in those earliest non-Christian sources, we don't for sure have the claim attested that it was a resurrection that they believed in. It could have, if all we had was those sources, it could be that they believed that God had vindicated Jesus in some other way, and that's why the Christian movement mushroomed after his crucifixion. But certainly in terms of giving us a broad kind of backbone, as Calum said, to start kind of plugging in and piling on more detailed evidence is very helpful.
So I wanted to get Calum's thoughts on that. And I know I'm kind of putting you guys against each other, but I just find this really interesting. Calum, do you agree that we can't really build a case for the resurrection on non-Christian sources alone?
I think if the only thing you had was the non-Christian sources, you wouldn't have enough evidence to say that the resurrection happened. But I think you don't need a whole load of extra detail from the Christian sources to make it quite plausible. I mean, one of the problems with the non-Christian sources is you don't have the background evidence of Jesus's ministry other than that he was a wise man and a miracle worker. And in that sense, the prior probability of the resurrection isn't boosted very much because we don't have the kind of detailed moral teachings of Jesus in them. We don't have much about his claims to be a god, that kind of thing. So certainly I don't think you could make a convincing case for the resurrection in total just from the non-Christian sources. But I do think it is surprisingly difficult to account for the beginnings of Christianity just from the non-Christian sources alone. So obviously the only, as Max says, the only explicit reference to the belief in the resurrection as the cause for the kind of Christian mushrooming, he put it, is possibly in Josephus. And that's one of the contested parts of Josephus where we don't know what Josephus said, if he included that line at all or anything similar to it. But nevertheless, I don't think you need to add much extra information to get a reasonably interesting historical case for the empty tomb and for the appearances. And the reason for that is that we can probably tell just from minimal kind of other historical information that the reason Christianity did start was because of this belief in the resurrection. It's something that no scholars would really deny, I think, that the early Christians believed in resurrection. It's attested in virtually every New Testament source. It's the language that they all used. It's what the church fathers spoke about. And it's pretty much historically uncontroversial that the early Christians believed in Jesus' resurrection. And so even if you just add in that tiny bit of information, that it was the resurrection that caused the movement to start again in Judea after Jesus' execution under Pilate. I think once you add in just that small piece of uncontroversial information, it does become actually quite difficult to explain that belief. And this is something that I think N.T. Wright builds his argument on quite a lot. So there are kind of two ways you can make a case for things like the appearances and for the empty tomb. One of them is just to look at the direct historical evidence for those, where we have the narratives describing them, and circumstantial evidence and direct historical evidence to do with them. But as N.T. Wright argues, you can actually make a reasonable historical case that these must have been the case, or else Christians never would have believed in a resurrection to begin with, just because of the meaning of the word resurrection, what it meant, and what the Jewish kind of belief was about it. It's very difficult to account for any kind of belief in resurrection at that time in that place, unless there was something quite significant to prompt it, like the empty tomb and like appearances to Jesus. And so even if you don't have the narratives about those, I think the fact that the early Christians did begin to believe in a resurrection, which you can mostly get from the non-Christian sources, just with a tiny bit of added information, which is uncontroversial, you can actually begin to build a case that there must have been something like an empty tomb and some appearances of Jesus, or what they thought were appearances of Jesus. Otherwise, they just never would have begun to use that word or believe in the resurrection or make these sorts of claims.
So as we start to fill out the case, I'm thinking of like two different things that would bear on what you were just talking about, and in specifically with respect to what resurrection meant. And so Sadducees and Pharisees back then did not believe in a kind of resurrection prior to the end of the world. They didn't believe that resurrection was going to happen to like one person instead of all people. And then I can't remember if it's the Pharisees or the Sadducees. I think it's the Sadducees that didn't believe in resurrection at all.
Mm-hmm.
So we have that information, which tells us that there's something going on there. But then also in Deuteronomy 21 and 22, which is something that you've pointed out before, Calum. I can't remember when, but I first heard this from you, which is kind of interesting. But in Deuteronomy 21:22, it says pretty explicitly that anyone hanged on a cross or a tree is cursed. And so basically after that, the disciples had every reason, it seems like, to go home and start over, because their leader was cursed instead of like risen to glory or whatever. So I think that those two facts are somewhat, is that what you're kind of thinking about there?
Yeah, so definitely there's some background that makes it difficult to explain a belief in a resurrection. So yeah, I think the fact that they rejected the idea of a resurrection, they rejected the idea that it would happen in the middle of history to one person, they rejected the idea that the Messiah would die. All of these facts kind of give a background that make it difficult to explain why Christians began to worship and believe in the resurrection of someone who was crucified and therefore seen as cursed by God, who was seen as a failed Messiah, that sort of thing. So I guess what that does is that eliminates some of the other explanations for the origin of the Christian belief, which might say something like, well, they liked Jesus's teaching, or they felt after Jesus' death that he was still with them in some sense. They had terminology for that. They had words that they could use to describe that. They could say Jesus was exalted, or they could say that Jesus was still with them in their hearts, or they could say he was in Abraham's bosom, or all these other kind of ideas that Jews had about the afterlife. But resurrection was a very specific idea that said this person has been bodily raised from the dead such that you can speak to him, you can see him, you can touch him, and he has the same sort of body, even though slightly different, as he would have had on earth. And you can't explain that belief just by reference to what Jews already believed, because everything in the Jewish beliefs before that suggested that that couldn't happen, that that was preposterous. And we see hints of this in the Gospels. So although this is already seen in people like Josephus, where Josephus talks about the views that the Jews had on resurrection, and you can see it in other places in Greco-Roman literature where you can see that they didn't believe in resurrection at all. You also get hints of that picked up on in the Gospels. So in the Gospel of Mark records that the Sadducees came to Jesus and they say that there's no resurrection, and they challenge Jesus on the idea of resurrection completely. And it's clear from this and from Josephus that Sadducees don't believe in any kind of resurrection, whether at the end of the world or not. And they try to ridicule Jesus by pointing to his belief in the resurrection. And in the same way, if you look in the book of Acts, in chapter 17, where Paul goes to Athens and he speaks to the Greeks, it says, Paul spoke to them in Athens, and when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. And this is just a small indication, and in fact, an indication that you can get from reading the literature more broadly, is that in the ancient world, they weren't just gullible people who believed in resurrections. They were just as skeptical of the resurrection or of any resurrection as any of us would be. So Greeks and Romans thought the idea was completely ridiculous and worthy of ridicule and mockery. Most Jews, in fact, didn't believe in it at all. So the Sadducees didn't believe in it at all. It was only really the Pharisees that had a strong belief in the resurrection. And even they never believed that the resurrection would occur before the end of time. They thought it was something that would happen to all of the righteous or everyone in general, all together on Judgment Day. But no one said the resurrection was something that happened before then.
Do you have anything to add, Max?
I would just add one more thing, which is that a possibility that liberal theologians will sometimes bring up is that, sure, Jesus' earliest followers believed that he had been resurrected from the dead, but resurrection didn't mean anything happening to a body. It was a spiritual resurrection, if you like, whatever that might mean. I think that reading of what resurrection meant is pretty easy to refute, actually. I mean, one point that's important here is that one of the main lines of evidence that is given for that view is Paul's discussion of the resurrection body in 1 Corinthians 15. But Paul himself makes it quite clear that even though he thinks the resurrection body has quite different properties from the earthly body, if you like, and he calls it a spiritual body, and he says that it won't consist of flesh and blood. But nonetheless, it's very clear that Paul thinks that it's the same body that's sown perishable, which is then raised imperishable. And so Paul himself clearly thinks that the resurrection body is in continuity with the present body. And so the idea that Jesus' earliest followers thought that resurrection was something that could have happened whilst Jesus' body was still rotting in the tomb is, I think, just not compatible with our earliest Christian evidence on the matter. And nor is it compatible with our more general background evidence about what Second Temple Jews believed. And the various passages in the Old Testament which look forward to a general resurrection of the dead, such as Daniel 12 or Ezekiel 37, I think it is. It's a very physical description of the resurrection of God reaching down into the dust of the earth and raising up the bones of the dead. So, yeah, there really is no reason, I think, to doubt that, whatever we may think about the matter, that Jesus' earliest followers were talking about something that happened to a dead body.
And I think this is something that you can see just by, as Max says, there are a number of sources which make this really clear. But it's something that you can actually see through our knowledge of archaeology. And one of the ways this is by looking at how Jews buried their dead. And the way they would normally do this in the Second Temple period is they would bury someone initially, and then once the flesh had decayed, they would gather up the bones again and put them in what was called an ossuary, which is just a bone box, and then bury the bone box again. And we have many, many hundreds of these from over Jerusalem in Israel in the first century and the surrounding kind of time period. And the reason they did this is because they thought the resurrection was something that happened to these bones. Now, obviously later Christians and theologians, when this was a real concern for them, they realized that even if the bones weren't collected together, God would still manage to resurrect the person. But it was a symbolic show that they really did believe that it was something physical, that they would collect the bones up so that God would raise and put new flesh on those bones and raise that person to life. And even if you go to Jerusalem now, if you go to the east side of the city where the Kidron Valley is, the whole Kidron Valley, just between the Mount of Olives and the old city of Jerusalem, is covered in an enormous graveyard full of Jewish tombs. And the reason for this is because they thought, according to certain Jewish scriptures, that is where the resurrection would first occur, because it's right in between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount. And people wanted to bury their dead in the Kidron Valley because that is where they thought God would raise people first. And of course, if you just believe in a spiritual resurrection, or if you just believe that once someone dies, they go to heaven, this sort of action doesn't make any sense, because the dead wouldn't be in the Kidron Valley, or they wouldn't come back to Jerusalem. They would just go up to heaven. And whether their bones were buried in a bone box or just left to rot in the ground or whatever also doesn't really matter. But what these burial practices testify to is the fact that actually, although later Christians realized that, you don't need to be buried in an absolutely certain way in order for resurrection to be possible, nevertheless, it testifies to the Second Temple Jewish belief that this was something physical, that they would bury their bones so that God could raise them. They would bury them in a specific place because they wanted to be the first ones to be raised from the dead. And they did this on earth, using the physical remains of the person, showing that they really did see it as a concrete physical event.
What's interesting is that I actually took a picture of those ossuaries, that hill that you're describing there. I took a big picture of it. That's actually the cover photo of a talk that I gave on the resurrection of Jesus. So I saw the same thing that you guys are seeing. Are there any other points that you want to make on that, about the objection that Jesus' resurrection and the way that they described it was purely spiritual? It wasn't actually a physical thing. Are there any other points that you want to make? Because I think that's actually a really important objection.
Yeah, one more point to add is just a linguistic one, really. So Calum pointed out earlier, there's this phrase which occurs in more or less every book of the New Testament, namely that Jesus was raised from the dead. And so, the fact that it's so widely attested in these various books of the New Testament tells us that this was the original belief of the followers of Jesus, that this is what had happened to him. So when we look in the Greek at this phrase, it's anastasis ekto nekron. And so anastasis is the word we translate as resurrection. More literally, it means standing up. And then ekto nekron means from the corpses. So you can see that when you sort of see just what those words meant, it doesn't actually make any sense really to talk about a non-bodily resurrection.
So let's fill out the case with some of the biblical evidence, the Christian sources. What facts can we start to fill out? And again, what we're doing is we've already set out the kind of outline, the broad outline of the case, or the facts of the crucifixion, the appearances, the empty tomb, and everything. We can ascertain most of these facts from non-Christian sources and get a broad outline of what happened. But then we can start to use the Christian sources and start to fill everything out, get all the details that we need. So let's start to fill those facts out with the biblical sources.
Yeah, so I think the first place that is very natural to begin, and where most biblical scholars do begin when talking about the New Testament sources, is so Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, a church that Paul planted in the Greek city of Corinth. So it was written about 55 AD, most scholars think, and we could, if you wanted, go into the reasons for dating it, but that's probably a little bit besides the point now.
We can at least just mention that scholars pretty much unanimously think that Paul is the author of this letter.
Yes.
And that most of them think that it was written around this time. I think that's sufficient.
Yes, I think that's right. So Paul, in this letter to the Corinthian church, written in about 55 AD, alludes to the fact that when he was with them the first time, which for other reasons we could go into, gets dated to about 51 AD. So Paul alludes to the fact that when he was with them then, in about 51 AD, he passed on to them this formula, or summary, if you like, and you find it in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And it begins by Paul saying, what I passed on to you as of first importance, what I received myself, I passed on to you as of first importance. And then he goes on to list, in chronological order, Jesus' death, his burial, then being raised on the third day, then appearing to Peter, the 12, 500 at once, and then James, and finally the appearance to Paul himself. So this summary is very important because, well, there's a couple of reasons why it's very important. One is that Paul clearly received it from others, and there's every indication that those others he received it from were the individuals who are named in that summary. So we know from Paul's letter to the Galatians, which virtually all scholars think Paul wrote, Paul tells us there that he visited Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion, which is normally reckoned to have been a couple of years or so after Jesus' crucifixion. So Paul visits Jerusalem about 5 or 6 years after Jesus' crucifixion, and he meets with Peter and James. And so it seems very likely that this kind of summary was something that Paul himself received at his conversion, or not very long afterwards, and certainly that
I forget who said it, but they basically said something like, when he met with them, they talked about more than just the weather when they were fellowshipping for several days.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, obvious, right, of course, and actually the Greek word hystereto is the verb that Paul actually uses in Galatians 1:18, and it means to sort of go on a fact-finding mission. So yeah, Paul would obviously have wanted to know what Peter and James knew, and so yeah, he had ample opportunity to check out this information from them. And so yeah, this summary that we find in 1 Corinthians 15 is very significant, for one thing, because Paul got it from the witnesses themselves, and also because it's evidently so early. It goes back at least before Paul received it, before he met Peter and James. So we're getting within like a very few years of the events. I think James Dunn even says a few months probably. So that's the very significant source, and that's where most biblical scholars would start in terms of the New Testament evidence.
And Calum, what about you?
Yeah, so when Paul writes this in 1 Corinthians 15, he's passing on what scholars generally agree is a creed, so that it's generally well preserved and in line with what actually happened. And what he says there is that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, i.e. the brother of Jesus, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me.
I just want to point out real quick that, again, this is from Paul himself writing this, and he got this from James and Peter when he met with them. Just think about that for a second. Think about how incredible it is that we have this early creed that Christians were going around telling each other, and we have it like in our Bibles. And if you didn't know that, then now you know. I just find that like super, super cool.
Yeah, exactly. And so if we go through it kind of one by one, so he starts with Christ being crucified or killed according to the scriptures. And this is something that there's not a historian in the world who would doubt for a second. So even the very liberal New Testament historian John Dominic Crossan says Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be, which is a pretty emphatic statement on just how good the evidence for this is. And the reason scholars think this is really convincing is for a number of reasons. First, it's in a bunch of the non-Christian sources. So Josephus says it, Tacitus says it, Lucian of Samosata says it, Marabar Serapion says it, and the Talmud, which is a bit later but based on probably quite a strong Jewish tradition, also says that he was crucified or hung specifically on the eve of Passover.
And did you already mention Tacitus?
Yes, yeah. And so there are a number of non-Christian sources alone that mention this, as well as all the Christian sources. So it's in every gospel, it's in every source underlying the gospels, it's in pretty much every New Testament letter as well. It's one of the central things that Christians spoke about. Moreover, it's the kind of thing Christians wouldn't make up because it was embarrassing for your Messiah to die. The idea of a Messiah was that they would come down and they would have a military victory over Rome and destroy Rome. And the idea of a Messiah dying, let alone dying in a way that suggested he was cursed by God, is something that you wouldn't make up. It would be like making up a superhero and trying to convince everyone they were a superhero and saying all these awful things about them, like they used to kill people or do these horrible things, or that God cursed them, that kind of thing. It's not the thing you'd make up. So it's almost certainly rooted in historical truth. There are a number of other reasons scholars think it's plausible. There's a lot of detail in the stories which seems to fit with historical reality. It's in the early sources. And it makes sense historically. If you look at Jesus's ministry, there are a number of things he did in his ministry which would have prompted this death. it's easy to see why the Jewish authorities would have felt threatened by Jesus with the parables he spoke about, with his action in cleansing the temple, with perhaps the anointing by the woman, or even if you just look at his followers before him. So John the Baptist was executed, and Jesus obviously came from a movement started by John the Baptist. And so it's not difficult to see, even from the context either, that Jesus would have been a pretty likely candidate for crucifixion. So it makes sense from the historical detail from the ministry. We have an overwhelming number of sources that support it, and it's not the kind of thing that you'd make up. And for those reasons, among others, I think scholars are pretty much, like I said, there wouldn't be a historian in the world who would deny it, I don't think.
All right, and so that was verse 3. We're working through this creed one by one, pretty much, and so okay. Let me also explain this. So we're working off of this creed, and so this is like one source, and then when we look at other sources, that just there's a historical word for it. It's called multiple attestation. Basically, that's when two independent sources describe the same event. And so when we're looking at, like, the creed says that Jesus was buried, he died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. When we're looking at other sources, that just provides even more additional evidence that this thing happened. And when historians find that in ancient history, which actually doesn't happen that often, then we can have more and more confidence that this thing actually took place. Just wanted to put that out there. So we worked through the crucifixion, and now in verse 4 it says that he was buried, and I think that's where we're going to turn to next.
Yeah, that's right. In terms of multiple attestation, the more independent sources we have, the more confident we are. There's a point I wanted to make on the multiple attestation thing before we go into the burial. Something that's interesting is that, so we have this fairly kind of bare bones summary in 1 Corinthians 15. So, death, burial, resurrection on the third day, then appearance to individuals. And Dale Allison has a nice table in his book, basically just pointing out, at the level of these kind of core events, there's a very strong kind of commonality between not only 1 Corinthians 15, but also all of the gospel sources actually have this basic structure. Jesus died, then he was buried in a tomb. Then, interestingly, the gospel sources concur that Jesus' burial was on the third day. So, they have Jesus crucified on the Friday, then the empty tomb being found on the Sunday. By the Jewish way of counting days, that could count as the third day, because parts of days can count as days in that way of thinking. And then obviously the appearances to various individuals, and the appearance to the 12, as I'm sure we'll come back to, being attested quite widely in those different sources. So that kind of backbone in 1 Corinthians 15 is shared in common across those gospel sources as well. And actually, it's also worth mentioning, in the book of Acts, Luke, author of both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, records that Paul gave this speech when he was on his first missionary journey, in Acts 13 verses 28 through 31. I won't read it out, but Paul basically gives a sort of summary of what happened to Jesus when he was put on trial and then crucified, then taken down from the tree and buried, but then he appeared to his followers. And that actually, again, seems to have the same basic backbone as that 1 Corinthians 15.
So turning back to the burial. Okay, so just to briefly reiterate, we're going through this creed. We talked about Christ's death for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, and now we're on verse 4, that he was buried. So Calum, help us fill that part out too.
Yeah, so verse 4, it says that he was buried. And this is something that actually a lot of the evidence for is by looking at the context and looking at the Jewish background. So although we have, the evidence from 1 Corinthians 15 that says he was buried, we have the evidence from the sources, which I think Max will say a little bit about. We also just know from Jewish practice, Jewish documents, and the archaeology of the time that this is something that would be overwhelmingly likely, even if we had no sources for it at all. And one of the main reasons for this is that although it seems slightly odd to our 21st century mindset, burial of the dead was one of the most sacred duties in Judaism. And it was a sacred duty partly for the sake of the person who was being buried, that it was respectful and that they would be able to be buried properly, and it was seen as awful for them if they weren't buried properly. But also, it was important because the land of Israel was to be kept pure and holy. And so in that case, you might think, well, maybe they didn't care about burying Jesus properly because he was a criminal. But even if that was the case, and I don't think that is the case for reasons we'll see, they still had an absolutely compelling sacred duty to bury criminals purely for the sake of the land of Israel. So when God gave them the land, he said, you have to keep it pure, keep it holy, and he gave them rules. And it was clear that if they left dead bodies out, then the land would be defiled because they had very strict rules about ritual purity. And so whether he was a criminal or not, Jesus would have needed to have been given a burial simply for the sake of the land, to keep the land holy in accordance with Jewish law.
What are your sources for that?
So there are a number of sources. So the tradition starts very early. I mean, from the start of the Bible, you can see the kind of concern for it. So in Genesis with the patriarchs, you see how important burial is to them. If you read the accounts carefully, when it talks about burying Joseph and burying Jacob and that sort of thing, burial is something that's clearly very important. Then in the Torah, it talks about the importance of burying people throughout the Old Testament in the books of Samuel and Kings and Ezekiel. Then if you look at the kind of literature between the Old and New Testament, it talks about very similar things. So in the book of Tobit, which is in Catholic Bibles, it talks about the importance of burial. Later works such as the Talmud talk about the importance of burial. A book called Sifri talks about the importance of burial. Josephus and Philo talk about it. The Dead Sea Scrolls talk about it. So it's something that comes up again and again throughout pretty much every strand of Jewish literature, from before the time of Jesus, just before the time of Jesus, and after the time of Jesus. This entire time, the importance of burial, particularly burial to keep the land pure, is stressed. And this is something that you see in archaeology as well. So we see, we have the remains of many buried people in first century Israel. We see how dutifully and assiduously it was done. But what's interesting is that we have the evidence from from one crucifixion victim and possibly other execution victims as well. Now, this is unusual because in most cases of crucifixion, there's no archaeological evidence of it because nails would be removed, or because often crucifixion was done by using ropes rather than by using nails. But interestingly, just a few decades ago, we found the remains of a Jewish person called Yehohanan. He was a first century Jew found around Jerusalem. And simply because of the angle that the nail was drilled into his ankle bones, they couldn't pull the nail out when he was buried, as they normally would have done. And so we found his ankle bone with a nail driven through it, showing that he was a victim of crucifixion. And yet he was given the same burial. He was buried with the practice of what's called oscillegium, which is the secondary burial where you bury someone initially, wait for the flesh to decay, and then bury their bones in a box. That's oscillegium, and it's called secondary burial because you bury them twice. We have his remains, which show that a crucifixion victim was buried properly in the same way. We have likely other execution victims. So we think we have some corpses of beheaded people that we found, and so on. So we have archaeological evidence as well that the execution victims and criminals were buried in just the same way as any other Jews would have been. And the main kind of opposition to this that comes from scholars is a few scholars who say, well, in the first century, we have lots of Jews who weren't buried properly. And this is a suggestion that actually, if Jesus was an enemy of the state or whatever, if he was executed as a criminal, he would have just been thrown in a ditch or buried in a ditch rather than buried in a tomb. But actually, if you look at that evidence for Jews who weren't buried, it was pretty much always in the Jewish-Roman War at the end of the 60s AD, which is when the Romans completely took over Israel. They killed thousands of Jews, burnt down the temple in Jerusalem, sieged Jerusalem completely, and the Jews just simply weren't in a position to bury their dead, even if they could at that time. And this is the reason Jews at that time weren't buried, but that's completely different to peacetime Judea, peacetime Israel, where the Jews had every opportunity to bury their dead. There was no reason why they couldn't bury their dead in Jerusalem in the 30s AD. And so there's every chance just from the general background that Jesus would have been buried. And what's interesting here is the time and the place that Jesus was buried, because we noted earlier that one of the main reasons for burying the dead was to keep the land pure. But we know that Jesus was killed and executed at Passover and just outside Jerusalem. Now, this is probably the holiest time of year, or one of the holiest times of year in the Jewish calendar. And it was the holiest place in the Jewish world. So it was Passover in Jerusalem. And given that the idea of burial was to keep the land pure and was to be pleasing to God, it just seems completely unthinkable that someone who was executed, who had left basically a defiled corpse behind, would just be allowed to defile the land at the holiest place in Judaism, at one of the holiest times of year, by the chief priests. That's just completely unthinkable from a historical perspective. And so those are some of the reasons, just from the background of Jewish burial, that it seems extraordinarily likely, even before you look at the literary evidence specifically for Jesus's burial. And that's why it seems very, very likely.
Yeah, and the literary evidence you're talking about mentions Joseph of Arimathea. Mm-hmm. And so I'm assuming, Max, that's where you're about to go next.
Yeah. Let's just start back up again quickly, though, with that early creed. So, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 4 says that he was buried. And, I think it's important to say, actually, that even if we didn't have the gospel sources that we're about to talk about in a minute, we would still have very good reason, just from this very sparse little summary that says he was buried, we would still have very good reason for thinking that Jesus was given a proper burial, that he was not just thrown in a ditch. The Greek verb is thapto, and it definitely is not the kind of word that one would associate with a disgraceful sort of burial, just being chucked in a ditch in the ground. Obviously, it doesn't tell us about Joseph of Arimathea, but even if we just had that one sentence from Paul's summary that he got from the Jerusalem apostles, that would be enough to tell us that Jesus would have been buried in a way that people would have kind of been able to identify the place of burial. And so, Joseph of Arimathea is recorded in all four Gospels as being a member of the Sanhedrin, the council the Jewish council that condemned Jesus to death. But Joseph of Arimathea, nonetheless, perhaps because he sympathized with Jesus, came to Pontius Pilate and asked for Jesus's body, and then was granted permission to take Jesus down from the cross and then bury Jesus in a sort of cave tomb, which was sealed by a circular stone. And we basically get the same account, broadly speaking, of this burial by Joseph of Arimathea in all four Gospels. And even if Luke and Matthew only had Mark as their source, and there's some reasons to think that they didn't just have Mark, but even if that's true, most probably John is a separate source from Mark, and so Joseph of Arimathea is multiply attested. But there's a few other reasons to think that this burial by Joseph of Arimathea really happened. So just taking the name Joseph of Arimathea itself. So Joseph is not mentioned anywhere else in the Gospels. And so he appears just here in this role of burying Jesus. Richard Borkham, the New Testament historian, has done some really neat research indicating that the personal names in the canonical Gospels of the New Testament are very likely authentic names of real people, because the frequencies of these names in the Gospels match so well with the frequencies of the names that we've found on things like tomb inscriptions in ancient Israel. So
something interesting on that point, Eckhard Schnabel has actually said that Joseph was the second most common male name among Palestinian Jews.
Yes, well, and the fact that of Arimathea has to be attached as this distinguishing mark also fits with that data point that you just mentioned. It was Joseph was a very common name, so you had to have a way to distinguish him from other Josephs, and so attaching his hometown Arimathea would be exactly the kind of way as we know from archaeology, that people with a common name would have been distinguished. The other thing is, with the name still, so just that in itself suggests that pretty much even these minor characters that just pop up here and there in the Gospels are very probably real people. Because if the Gospel authors had been scattering around fictional names to add a bit of color to the stories, they wouldn't have produced this very striking correspondence with the actual relative popularity of the names as we know it now from archaeology. So already we've got reason to think Joseph of Arimathea is probably a real person. But we can also add something known as the criterion of embarrassment, which is that basically, when someone tells a story that is awkward or embarrassing or uncomfortable from their point of view, that's some reason to think that they're not just making it up. So the fact that Joseph of Arimathea is a member of the Sanhedrin, which is the bad guys, right, from the point of view of the early church. So the fact that the one who buries Jesus honorably is Joseph of Arimathea, this member of the council that condemned Jesus to death, is some reason to think that this story is not made up. Because, it would be much less awkward for the gospel writers to have some of Jesus' male disciples carry the burial out, such as Peter or John, and so on.
Let me just say real quick, so you've mentioned Joseph of Arimathea, but I just want to mention where that's found. It's found all over the Gospels, but particularly in Mark chapter 15, verses 42, it says, "It was preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he learned from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph bought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid." So that's where this is coming from. It's coming from Mark chapter 15, but also in other parts of the gospel, or other gospels.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. That's right. And actually it's useful that you just read that out. It's a very simple, sparse account. And New Testament scholars have taken note of this, that it doesn't try to interweave passages from the Old Testament to try and show fulfillment of prophecy or anything like that. It just narrates it in a very kind of matter-of-fact way. It doesn't have any of the hallmarks of embellishment. I mean, maybe I'll hand over to Calum actually to talk about some of the archaeological evidence which actually specifically pertains to Jesus' tomb, which is again a further line of evidence for the authenticity of this burial story.
Yeah, so there's a couple more things to say there. One is just a quick note on the kind of criminal stuff, whether criminals would be given a proper burial, as well as this being kind of known from archaeology. We also, and from the theory of why people were buried, we also know it just from a number of sources, like the Temple Scroll in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Old Testament talks about criminals being buried, and other Dead Sea Scrolls, Josephus and Philo, and so on. And some of the Roman law suggests that actually Romans didn't really interfere much with Jewish custom, and they would be especially unlikely to do so at a provocative and volatile time like Passover. So there's good reason, again, from the documentary sources as well, to think that this part of the story is accurate, where the Romans handed over a criminal to be buried according to Jewish custom. And in fact, if you look at the Jewish customs, when it says that Joseph was a member of the Sanhedrin, this actually might well fit with what the Jewish law said, because there are some hints in Jewish law that it was one of the duties of the Sanhedrin to provide places for criminals to be buried if no one else did. And that's part of the reason for burial being to keep the land from being defiled. So it fell to the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, to be responsible for that. But that fits quite nicely with the detail that we find in the Gospels. But as Max says, there are good reasons to think archaeologically that we have the place where Jesus was buried. And one of the reasons this is kind of intrinsically likely, or likely just from considering the background context, is that we've talked about reasons why Jews buried their dead, and they buried them properly. And so we know that Jesus wouldn't have just been thrown in a ditch and left in a kind of unidentified or vague location. He would have been buried in a specific tomb. And tombs are much easier to remember. And we have a number of sources that say people followed him to the tomb. People knew which tomb it was. It was a tomb near where he was crucified, so a very memorable location. It was partly women who saw where he was buried, and you don't make women up as witnesses because their testimony wasn't taken very seriously, and so on. But there are also a number of reasons to think that Jesus's tomb site would have been remembered, even past the fact that it would just be likely in itself that they would know where he was buried. And one of the reasons for this is what we call secondary burial, where the flesh decayed and the bones were taken later. And this was a fairly widespread practice, and it was in preparation for the resurrection, which we know Jesus believed in. And so it seems likely that they would have remembered where his body was, as they would have remembered where most bodies were, in order that they could perform secondary burial in this way. But they would also remember the site of the location for private mourning, as is recorded in the Gospels and is fairly common in mourning the deceased. We know that they would have wanted to anoint Jesus as they did in the Gospels. And we also know that often criminals were taken to a family tomb later. So sometimes they were buried just initially. And in Jesus' case, we have evidence that he was buried in a sort of hurried way near the tomb, without much thought for whether he would be buried in a particular place that they wanted him to be buried. But many criminals were taken from their first place of burial to be later taken to a family tomb to join their family, as we see in the Old Testament. Being buried in what's called gathered to your ancestors is shown in the Old Testament and in really, really ancient archaeology in Israel to be a really widespread and important idea, that you would be buried literally with your ancestors and with your family. And so that would be another reason to remember where Jesus was buried, and particularly for his family to remember where he was buried. And that's exactly what we see completely incidentally in the reports of his mother seeing where he was buried. But what's most interesting about this, I think, is that we have really, really quite compelling evidence that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, where Christians commemorate the crucifixion and burial of Jesus, is in fact where Jesus was buried. And there are a number of indications of this. Okay, so if we think about the particular site where Jesus was buried, one of the most interesting hints to do with this, it begins with the Gospel of John. So in the Gospel of John, it says, they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. Now there was a garden in the place where he was crucified, and in the garden there was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And so, because it was the Jewish day of preparation and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. Now, if we compare this to the modern site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, what archaeology shows here is quite interesting. And let's start with really recent evidence that just turned up last year, or 2 years ago now. So in 2017, the archaeologists working kind of in that area went to the site, and they did some of the first archaeological work done there in a really long time. And what they found was quite surprising, in that often when you go to Israel, you look at these kind of traditional sites for events in Jesus's life, and they're often just made up. And that's completely understandable. We know in most kind of religions and pilgrimage sites, there's lots of scope for making things up. And sometimes doing it centuries and centuries after the events actually occurred. And some people wondered, since Jerusalem has such a turbulent history where it was taken over many times, it was sieged many times and destroyed many times over the 2,000 years since Jesus lived, that actually it seems unlikely that Christians would remember where Jesus was buried for 2,000 years. But in 2017, we actually found pretty good evidence, pretty compelling evidence, in fact, that it was the exact place that's been commemorated since at least the early 4th century. And the evidence for this was when they looked in the tomb itself and they looked in the shrine, they found that the Roman kind of remains commemorating Jesus' death dated to the mid-4th century. And this itself is quite astonishing, because the mid-4th century is when Constantine lived and when his mother found the tomb and began to kind of commemorate it officially. Obviously, as that was the time when Christianity became very acceptable and the kind of began to be the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. And in those 16 centuries or so, we know now with pretty much certainty that the same site has been commemorated, despite Jerusalem's turbulent history, despite scholars sometimes doubting whether it was the same site, we know that since that time, since the time of Constantine pretty much, the same site has been venerated by Christians. So the question is, did the same site survive from Jesus' time to Constantine's time? Well, there's good reason to think that it has been. And one of these reasons is that the history of the site is pretty well known. So Christians said that pretty much within a century of Jesus' crucifixion, the Emperor Hadrian, when he attacked Jerusalem in the early 2nd century, he basically expelled all the Jews from Jerusalem, and he built a temple on top of where Jesus was venerated, or where his tomb was venerated. And this seems plausible enough that Hadrian would pick one of the kind of main Christian sites that Christians had remembered and built a temple on top of it. And we have evidence that Hadrian actually mimicked the temple architecture when he built his temple, suggesting that the site had some religious significance, even in the 2nd century then, because we have some of those remains. And then, of course, the history of the site is just the history of Hadrian's temple up until the time of Constantine, where it was a gap of about 2 centuries, and it was a fairly well-known site in Jerusalem. So it's fairly plausible that it would have been remembered. So all this kind of fits. The tradition fits. We can understand why the tradition would be there. And we can see that from the Roman period, we have good evidence that the same site has been preserved, and probably the same site since around the time of Jesus, and certainly since the time of Hadrian, which was fairly shortly afterwards, within a couple of generations of Jesus' life. But what's extra interesting about this is looking at the particular evidence and linking it to the Gospel of John. So John says things like he was crucified near the city, implying it was outside the city. There was a new tomb hewn from rock. There was a garden, and so on, and it was near the crucifixion site. And in fact, archaeology has pretty much verified all of this. So archaeology has shown that there was a garden or a field or some sort of agricultural area where the tomb was in previous generations. They've shown that it was likely near a garden, as John describes, or in a garden. They've shown that the entire site was a quarry in the 1st century, again suggesting that this would be where a tomb hewn from rock would be. They found remarkably 1st century tombs there. So we know with certainty that it was a 1st century Jewish cemetery at the site. So even if you go now to Jerusalem and you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, literally just about, I remember it being about 20 meters away from the site of Jesus' tomb, we have what archaeologists have shown to be 1st century tombs. And so we know this is a 1st century Jewish cemetery. Interestingly, there are 2 kinds of tomb kind of in the area, 2 main kinds of ways that Jews would be buried. One would be where they would have what they called kochim or loculi, which are just shafts that come off a main central area of the tomb, and you can push a coffin into each kind of low horizontal shaft, or you can push an ossuary in there or something like that. And there would be about 4 to 6 or so loculi or kochim coming out of that main central area. And those would be all on the floor. But the other main type of burial would be a burial in a tomb which had a kind of main central area, but had a kind of bench at the side with an arch going over it. And these are called arcosolia. And what the Gospels seem to imply, although they don't talk about it very strongly, they just give subtle hints. So when they talk about Jesus' burial and his tomb being found, they say that there were angels sitting where Jesus lay. They say that his grave clothes were left there. And there are other hints that Jesus was laid not kind of on the floor or in a coffin or buried in one of these kochim on the ground, but that he was buried kind of on a bench. And that seems to imply now, given our knowledge of archaeology, that this would have been an arcosolium kind of tomb. And what's really interesting is that although this isn't stressed in the Gospels, it's not emphasized to the extent that later Christians going back would say, aha, it must have been this site because we know it was an arcosolium. It just hints at that being the kind of tomb. And if you look at the archaeology now of the area, the only tomb that has been found to be an arcosolium in that vicinity is the one that seems to have been remembered as Jesus' burial site. So that's another really interesting piece of evidence. And then the final piece of evidence that we could talk about today, which just kind of confirms, I think, the conservatism and the stubbornness and the kind of reliability and stability of the tradition here, is the exact site and its relationship to the city walls. So if we read the Gospels, it says Jesus was crucified near the city, i.e., probably outside the city. But this is strange from a modern perspective, because if you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre now, you'll find that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is well within the old city walls in Jerusalem. And so there seems to be a conflict. It has been inside the walls since about the 40s AD, so very soon after Jesus' time. But what this suggests is that if you were making up Jesus' burial site in accordance with the gospel traditions, even just 10 years after his crucifixion or burial, even if you were making it up in 50 AD, and you knew the tradition that said he was crucified outside the city and buried outside of the city, you would put his tomb outside what are now the current city walls, or you would say they were much further away from the city. You wouldn't pick a site that by the time you were writing was already within the city walls, because people would know that conflicts with the tradition. But they knew apparently that Jesus was buried at this particular site. And it was only recently that we discovered that at the time, in the 30s AD, Jesus' burial site, which we now know as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, would have been outside the city walls. But within 10 years of his crucifixion, it was within the city walls. But Christians remember this so kind of reliably and stably that they identified the site and they said, we don't care where the walls are. We know this is where Jesus was buried. And so even if this seems bizarre by modern standards, or even if it seems to conflict with the written tradition by modern standards, we know this is where Jesus was buried. And actually, looking at the archaeology of the walls of Jerusalem seems to show that that seems to have been right after all. And so there are a number of factors that come together to suggest that actually this really was where Jesus was buried. And this is a fairly mainstream scholarly opinion. So you have people like James Charlesworth, who's one of the top biblical scholars in the world at Princeton University. Even his verdict on the site of Jesus' crucifixion is that he says there's a consensus among archaeologists that Jesus was possibly and perhaps probably crucified on this white stone. And when you look at the tomb in particular, I think the evidence is even stronger, because we know it was a tomb. We know the exact site. We know that it fits with the nature of Jesus's tomb as described in the Gospels. And so I think the evidence that we actually have Jesus's tomb preserved today is actually extremely strong.
Yeah, you talked about the non-Christian sources. We have Christian sources, and then we also have archaeological evidence that Christ was buried.
And then the only other thing to say, which is really striking given how pilgrimage sites normally work and given what the land of Israel is normally like, is that there is not a single competing burial site in the tradition. And normally when you look at these famous figures, or when you look at the history of these people and tourism that builds up after them, there's all sorts of places suggested for where they were buried, or places where they were supposed to have done one or other of these things. And that's what you'd expect if people were just making up these things. But in the Gospels and in the later archaeological tradition, in the tradition of Christian pilgrimage, there's never been a single other site that has been suggested as where Jesus was crucified and buried. And that again just shows how reliable and how conservative the early Christians were when it came to deciding where Jesus was buried. And they knew that they couldn't just make somewhere up. They had to go with what the tradition said.
So far we've talked about the origin of the Christian belief, the fact that belief in Jesus' resurrection was pretty unusual, and that we've got to have some kind of explanation for that. But then we also talked about the crucifixion, that he died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. That's all in verse 3. Verse 4, that he was buried. And then actually after this comma right here, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures. And that's where we're turning to next, the empty tomb. And what's interesting is that a lot of people point out that it doesn't actually say anything about an empty tomb here. But a lot of Christians, William Lane Craig, for example, says that it's implied, at least, because of what we know resurrection meant, and that when you're buried and then when you're risen, we're talking about, and you even mentioned it, Max, that that term raised, it actually means to stand up, in a sense. And so the empty tomb is therefore somewhat implied there. But let's get into some of the evidence for the empty tomb.
Good. Well, I mean, the creed is a good place to start, because actually it just gives an opportunity to look at what I would say is the major argument against the historicity of the empty tomb, which is that Paul doesn't explicitly mention it in this creed. I'll basically just say two things about this. So one thing to say is that obviously arguments from silence are quite precarious in general, especially in ancient history. But But
So explain what an argument from silence
yeah,
is for anyone that might not know.
yeah, good. An argument from silence is where you say this source doesn't mention X, therefore X probably didn't happen. So the reason I don't think that works in this case is just that this is a very compressed summary of the events that Paul is kind of reeling off to the Corinthians. And actually, when you think about it, an empty tomb by itself isn't particularly impressive evidence for anything. I mean, for all the Corinthians know, an empty tomb could be because of grave robbery. And so what's much more evidential from Paul's point of view is the appearances. And so it's not surprising that Paul spends the most time on them. The other thing is that the empty tomb, according to all four Gospels, was discovered by women. And we'll come back to this point in a minute. But just for now, we'll say that Paul would have been aware of how the prejudices of his audience to whom he was writing would have meant that they would take it probably less seriously if he mentioned this fact that the tomb was discovered by women. And so all in all, like just the mere fact that Paul doesn't explicitly mention it doesn't seem to be a very good reason to discount it. I think we can go a little bit further than that, though, and say that, yeah, as you hinted at already, for a first century Jew like Paul, just given what resurrection meant, and given the fact that it meant, something happening to a dead body, the fact that Paul has clearly stated that Jesus was buried and then raised implies that the place in which Jesus was buried was left empty afterwards. And so I think N.T. Wright made this point. So it says that he was buried and then that he was raised on the third day. To add, and the tomb was found empty, would be a bit like saying, and Cameron walked down the street and he used his feet. There's no need at all for Paul to add that. So I think all in all, there's no good argument from silence against the empty tomb from the fact that Paul doesn't mention it explicitly. I think it's quite clear that just the very language of resurrection presupposes it in conjunction with a burial. But then I think we can turn to what the gospel sources have to offer us here. So just as in all four Gospels, we have Joseph of Arimathea carrying out the burial of Jesus with, broadly the same details. So too, then we have the story of Mary Magdalene accompanied by some other women early on the Sunday morning, coming and finding the tomb with the stone rolled away and Jesus' body is gone.
The purpose that they were going there was because they were trying to put spices and whatnot and pay their respects basically to Jesus' body.
That's right. They wanted to pay their respects and anoint the body. And the fact that it was women is something that has impressed most historians. And the reason is fairly straightforward, is just that we have plenty of ancient sources which give us a flavor of male attitudes towards the testimony of women. So we have, for instance, Josephus saying that the testimony of women should be disregarded because of their propensity for basically for hysteria and for gullibility. And this is, very typical. And in fact, we even in the New Testament sources have indications of male attitudes towards female testimony. In Luke's gospel, it says that when the women told the men what they had seen, the men thought that they were telling idle tales. And that's a very plausible reflection of those male attitudes in the first century. So all that to say, if early Christians wanted to make up a story of the empty tomb, and they wanted to make it maximally sort of persuasive and believable to their contemporaries, then they would have every reason to attribute the discovery of the empty tomb to some prominent male disciples like Peter and John. And indeed, actually, what we see is in Luke's gospel and John's gospel, then we do have these subsequent accounts of John and, perhaps it's John and Peter coming to the empty tomb after the women. Now, whatever one thinks about the historicity of those accounts of John and Peter coming to the tomb, even if one was quite coming at it quite skeptically and saying this is sort of early Christian apologetics, well, that only serves to underscore the point about it being embarrassing to have the women be the first discoverers of the tomb, because it sort of attests the anxiety of the authors of Luke's gospel and John's gospel that it can't just be the female witnesses who are listed as having discovered Jesus' empty tomb. And I think it's worth saying that some skeptics have tried to sort of undermine this point about the female testimony. James Crossley has a paper, biblical scholar in the UK, where he has tried to undermine this point about the criterion of embarrassment with the women, where he says things like, well, female testimony in law courts wasn't actually as held in such low regard as we're sometimes led to believe. Now, that's actually, maybe that's true, but it's actually a bit beside the point. And the reason is that what's most important in this case is not so much like testimony in a court case scenario, but it's the delivery of divine revelation to women first rather than men. And the scholar Richard Borkham shows that it's this that would be most offensive to Jewish men in the first century. This idea that God gave this very important piece of divine revelation to women rather than men. That's the thing that would have been offensive and embarrassing. Not so much how well qualified women were to testify in a sort of court case scenario. Another thing that skeptics have said is that, well, the gospel authors had to invent female witnesses at the empty tomb because the men had all fled. So, Mark's gospel records that when Jesus is arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, the male disciples flee. One point to make there, I think this should be fairly obvious. Why should a fictional empty tomb story feel constrained by actual facts? After all, it's a fictional story. The author of a fictional story has maximal editorial freedom. Why would they not just say that the male disciples were there, even if they weren't? And in any case, there is no indication at all that the male disciples fled completely out of the surroundings of Jerusalem. Rather, actually, all of the accounts indicate that they fled away from Jesus, but they stayed in the vicinity of Jerusalem until the Passover was finished. And so I don't think that argument holds any weight either. I think I'll just mention one more, which is that James Crossley says that, well, there are male angels at the tomb, and so maybe that would overcome people's sort of sense of embarrassment about the female eyewitnesses. I mean, I kind of struggle to take that argument seriously at all, because the male angels are obviously not able to play the role of people being able to come and ask them, what did you see? Clearly, the female eyewitnesses are the ones who are being put forward by the gospel authors as the human witnesses who informed everyone else about the empty tomb. And so, yeah, I think all in all, it is a strong reason for thinking that the gospel empty tomb stories are authentic. And what's more, the fact that it's these women who are the witnesses of the empty tomb also kind of rules out the wrong tomb theory, because it's these same women who are listed as having observed where Jesus was buried. And as Calum said, from what we know about the background, first century Judaism, there's every reason to think that the women would have taken note of the location of Jesus' tomb. So yeah, so I think the criterion of embarrassment and the fact that it was female witnesses, when the early church were in a sense kind of shooting themselves in the foot by having this important story about Jesus' empty tomb being found by witnesses whom, from the point of view of society at large, were not believable witnesses. And they didn't have to do that to them. They didn't sort of have to hamstring themselves in that way. But I think, we can. There are more reasons besides that we can point to for thinking that the empty tomb story is authentic. Another one relates, in a sense, to everything we've been saying about the burial. If Jesus really was buried in a tomb in an identifiable location, which was known to people in Jerusalem, and obviously we've just talked through the many reasons for thinking that that's the case, then yeah, I think it is hard to imagine how the disciples could have come to this firm belief that Jesus had been raised when the tomb was available for their inspection. If Jesus' body was still in that tomb, it's very hard to see how they could have come to a belief that Jesus had been raised from the dead, given what it meant to say that he had been raised from the dead. So yeah, I don't know, maybe Calum wants to add some things.
Yeah, so as Max kind of says, I think it's really important. I mean, all the arguments he's given, I would agree with. And I think it's important that the burial accounts do a lot of extra work in this, in the sense that, there's such good evidence for Jesus' burial and in a particular location that it's kind of impossible that Christianity would start knowing that Jesus was buried in a particular place if the tomb wasn't found empty. If they knew where Jesus' tomb was, as they almost certainly would have done, if Jesus' tomb wasn't empty, if he was still in there, they would have just gone to it and shown that he was in there. And so that is itself just an argument for the tomb being found empty. But there's a couple of other things as well that just kind of add to this likelihood. So one is the fact that if you look at the narratives, they're fairly simple stories with little embellishment. So if you look at the later apocryphal gospels, a century or so after the canonical gospels, they say bizarre things like they went to the tomb and a talking cross came out of the tomb and Jesus came out of the tomb with his head in the clouds, that sort of thing. All these very, very bizarre stories that clearly show a lot of embellishment. But actually, if you look at the gospel accounts, there's very little embellishment. It just says they found the tomb, they ran and showed the other disciples that the tomb was empty. It doesn't add lots of Old Testament prophecy. It doesn't add lots of theology. It doesn't add other signs of late kind of storytelling. It's just a simple story with little embellishment, which scholars think makes it sound like an early story. But it's also a story that seems to be attested by non-Christians. So if you look at Matthew 28, it records the Jewish response. And the Jewish response isn't, you've lost the tomb, or you've got the wrong one, or that he's still in the tomb. The Jewish response is that the disciples had stolen the body. And similarly, if you look at later writings like Justin Martyr, he kind of suggests the early Jewish response was the same. And so you might cast doubt on the reliability of those, and that's fair enough. But there's no real reason to doubt that that's what the Jews in fact said.
Can I just read this out? Because I think it helps to put a little context here. So this is Matthew 28 and 11 through 15. I'm just going to read the whole thing, and then you can see why this is important, because they weren't trying to talk about the empty tomb when they were actually discussing this. So I'll just read here. While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. Matthew is telling this to his readers. This is what the Jews were saying.
Right, and it seems difficult that Matthew would be able to get away with saying that writing in this context if the Jews to this day were not still saying it. If it was just manifestly false that to this day the Jews still maintain this story, then he would never have got away with writing it. And so that suggests that actually what the people who rejected Christianity did think was that disciples had stolen his body. And that again attests to the fact that his tomb was found empty. One last thing I think I would add is going back right to the start when I talked about the literary source from Pliny the Younger, who talks about the early Christians and how they acted. And he talks about them singing hymns to Christ as a god, taking oaths to abstain from adultery and theft and that sort of thing. But he also says that on a fixed day they met. And what's interesting about this is it seems to hint at the idea that they had a sort of holy day, and perhaps one that was distinct from the Sabbath. And this is interesting because in the Gospels, there's no significance to the idea of a Sunday. In the Gospels, the only significance to any day is the Sabbath, and there's lots of controversy about the Sabbath, but there's no suggestion that the Sunday was a particularly important day. But what the Gospels do suggest as being important on the Sunday was the fact that Jesus' tomb was found empty then. And this is, fairly clearly said on the third day, on the next day, and so on. And what's really interesting about this is that in the Jewish calendar, the Sabbath was, again, a central part of Jewish thought. I mean, if you go to Israel now, where probably most people are not very religious Jews, nevertheless, it's almost impossible to get public transport on a Saturday. You can do very little on a Saturday. Most stuff is shut. It's very little to do. It's very difficult to do anything. And I think as Westerners going there, you realize just how seriously it's taken. And that's in modern day Israel, which is a fairly reasonably secular country, not many very religious Jews.
Here's one example. We went there a couple of years ago, and the hotel that we stayed at, they have a specific elevator just for Jews that basically stops on every single floor so that they don't have to push any buttons, so they don't have to actually do any quote unquote work. They just basically get on the elevator when it opens, they ride up to their floor because it opens at every floor, and then they just get off. That's right. That's exactly. The kind it's taken that seriously.
Yeah. And then you wind back to first century Israel when everyone was a religious Jew. They had the temple and they had, the traditional Jewish second temple kind of setup. And the Sabbath was an extremely important part of that. It was the thing that caused Jesus' controversy with the authorities. It was part of how God created the world. And it was a central part of how they celebrated their faith. It was extraordinarily important. And yet we find that the Christians had their holy day the Sunday instead, and they seem to neglect the Sabbath and change to the Sunday. They effectively changed God's calendar. And this is something that you don't just do out of choice in that world. You don't just choose, we're going to celebrate a different day. Because in Genesis, it says, keep the Sabbath. Well, in Genesis, it said God rested on the seventh day specifically. And then in the rest of the Torah, it said, keep the Sabbath. It doesn't say just keep a day off. It picks the Sabbath. And so for Jews to change and to start celebrating the Sunday was actually really significant. Now, of course, the religious Jewish Christians kept the Sabbath as well. And the early Jewish Christians kept Torah and they kept to the Jewish law. They didn't just neglect the Jewish law. But nevertheless, it was still striking, I think, that they began to venerate Sunday as a holy day. And in time, it began to be the main holy day for Christians at large. And this suggests that there must have been something that happened on the Sunday in particular. And what the Gospels suggest is that the Sunday is when the empty tomb happened. And therefore, it's not a crazy connection to think that actually this tradition of the empty tomb being found on a Sunday in particular is a very strong tradition, so strong, in fact, that it changed essentially the religious calendar. And for a tradition that strong and that important to be changed in that way, that does, I think, suggest that some of the specific details about the finding of the empty tomb, like the fact that it was found on a particular day, the Sunday, I think that suggests with quite considerable force that really did happen on the Sunday and that the Gospels have recorded that accurately.
I think the empty tomb is probably one of the most important facts that must be established in a successful case for the resurrection point, because if you think about it, so if there really was an empty tomb, okay, Jesus was buried and then 3 days later his tomb was found empty, you have to have some kind of explanation why that is, right? Bodies don't just go missing. There's got to be some explanation. So either the disciples stole it, something else happened that explains why that tomb was found empty. And I think this is why skeptics are so bent on trying to either explain away or maybe forward objections to the empty tomb. Once you can establish that Jesus was buried and then his tomb was found empty, I think you're going a long way in establishing that something happened and you got to explain it some way.
Yeah, exactly. I think so.
So moving on, we've talked about the crucifixion, the burial, empty tomb, and now the last one that we really need to discuss is the appearances. And these are not, by appearances, we're not saying that he actually bodily appeared to people. We're saying that different people, different groups of people had experiences of the risen Jesus. So we're not like smuggling in the conclusion of the argument into this fact here. We're just saying that people had experiences, things changed, they went on living differently than they were before. And so, yeah, let's dig into the evidence here.
Well, I mean, we've already talked about the importance of the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 in the sense that this is something that virtually all New Testament scholars, even those who would be very skeptical of saying that the Gospels contain the testimony of eyewitnesses, they would nonetheless grant that this creed by Paul was given to him by the witnesses whose experiences are listed in this formulation. And so, yeah, it seems that it's very hard to deny that the followers of Jesus, Peter, the 12, and so on, really did have experiences that convinced them that they had seen Jesus alive again. And of course, I'm sure we'll come back to this when we talk about explanations for all of this, but it is striking that a number of the recipients of these appearances of the risen Jesus listed in 1 Corinthians 15 are groups of people. So the 12, and this appearance to the 12 is probably the best attested of all, actually. It's attested in this short creed, but it's also attested in all of the canonical Gospels, or at least, and of course, we've got the issue that Mark ends at 16 verse 8, according to most scholars. But even there, the appearance to the gathered disciples is implied in the words of the young man who tells the women that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee, and tell his disciples and Peter that you'll see him there. So yeah, this appearance to the 12 as a group is seems to be very strongly attested, and from what I can tell, it's accepted by the overwhelming majority of New Testament scholars. Then we have this really intriguing appearance to 500 people at once. If it wasn't for the fact that this was in Paul's summary, this one would probably be written off. If it was in, let's say, the Gospel of John, this appearance to 500 would no doubt be, dismissed by many New Testament scholars as legendary. But the fact that it's in this early summary of Paul's, which, Paul received this information from the Jerusalem apostles. And what's more, what's really interesting is he says, more than 500 at once, many of whom are still alive, though some have died. That really seems to be underscoring the fact that the Corinthians to whom Paul is writing could in principle go and talk to these witnesses if they wanted to. And I think implicit in there is that Paul obviously thinks that these witnesses would have something striking to tell. I don't think that Paul would say, imply that you can go and talk to them if they had some kind of vague ecstatic experience when they were gathered together.
This is one of the points that Richard Swinburne makes, actually, is that Paul, if you just read his letters, he's like a really honest person. So there's no way that he would say something like that, just making it up, basically.
Yes, I mean, I think that's right. Paul's sincerity is very clear, and basically no scholar that I can think of doubts that Paul is being completely sincere, even if they think he's mistaken. I don't think anyone thinks that Paul is being deceitful. And so, I think it is significant that Paul is basically willing to vouch for this claim that 500 people or more, saw Jesus at once, and is basically giving an implicit invitation to people to go and ask these some of these people who are still alive what they saw. Then we have the appearance to James. So this is almost certainly the brother of Jesus. And so, this is an interesting one because it does look as though from at least two independent gospel sources, Mark and John, the brothers of Jesus were not particularly sympathetic to Jesus during his ministry. And yet, later when you read the book of Acts, we see that James is this really important figure. He seems to preside over this apostolic council in chapter 15 of Acts. And non-Christian sources like Josephus tell us about James, the brother of Jesus, and how pious he was, and how he was executed as a martyr, as a Christian martyr. And it's really interesting that we have seemingly a James who starts out not very sympathetic to his brother's ministry, and then later on a James who's almost the head of the Jerusalem church. So this very brief mention in Paul's summary that then Jesus appeared to James is very significant, because it seems quite plausible that this appearance to James is the thing that changed James from being somewhat skeptical to being a devoted follower of Jesus.
And so from here we go on to the apostles.
Yeah, so I mean, probably not too much more to say about this one. The apostles, it's not totally clear who is included in that group. Presumably the 12 are included in the apostles, but then it seems like others besides are also included in that group.
Yeah, Swinburne has argued also that it's likely that these apostles were also present at the appearance to the 500.
Yes, and so in terms of trying to line up this appearance to the apostles with anything in the Gospels, it's possible that this is the same appearance as the one that Luke narrates, when Jesus leads them out to the Mount of Olives and then ascends. Maybe. I mean, it's hard to be sure, really. And then, of course, finally, the appearance to Paul, which is again significant because Paul, as we know from his own writings and then independently from the book of Acts, Paul started out as a hater of Jesus and the Christian movement. And it's completely clear from what Paul himself says that it was this appearance to Jesus that caused him to do an about turn.
So Calum, did you want to jump in at this point and add anything?
Yeah, so I mean, we basically have, some of these appearances are very strongly attested. As I said, that there's the appearance to the 12, which is very widely attested. Okay, but apart from that, there are some other reasons to take these stories seriously. That's to say, not just Paul's very brief summary, but also the gospel narratives. So the stories don't look like they're what you could have generated just by kind of reading the Old Testament passages about what the future resurrection of the dead would be like. So, Daniel, in Daniel 12, it says that, at the general resurrection of the dead, the people who are raised up will shine like stars. And when you read the gospel resurrection narratives, there really is nothing that looks like an attempt to show that Jesus' resurrection conforms to these Old Testament depictions of what the resurrection would be like. And then, in fact, you have a number of features of these stories that are almost kind of puzzling and are not obviously the kind of things that you would make up, such as that, people are doubtful sometimes at first when they see Jesus, and sometimes they don't recognize him at first. And the fact that some of the recipients of the appearances are women. In fact, I think there's a strong case that the first appearance of all was to Mary Magdalene, which is mentioned in both Matthew's Gospel and John's Gospel, probably independently. The idea that you would make up the first appearance being to this woman, Mary Magdalene, rather than Peter the Rock, doesn't seem very plausible that you would do that, unless that you would say that unless it's what really happened. And yeah, more generally, I think the sincere belief that Jesus had been raised, when you just think about what would it take to get a bunch of people to really believe this, and to believe it in the case of at least some of them to the point of martyrdom. And we certainly know, that all of them faced at least violent persecution, if not death, because Paul says that he violently persecuted the church. So to get a bunch of people to believe this that sincerely, when you think about it, it seems like it would require something like the sorts of experiences that are narrated in the gospel resurrection narratives.
Right. And so, I mean, this is we've covered a lot so far, and I think that we're pretty much ready at this point to go on to different types of explanations or explanations on offer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, just to briefly get an overview of the evidence that we're going to be discussing, we talked about the burial, we talked about the crucifixion. I guess crucifixion happens before the burial, and then we have the empty tomb, the appearances. We also talked about the unusualness of a resurrection happening in like the middle of history, only to one person. So there's a whole list of evidence that we've talked about, and the next step, like I said, is to figure out, well, what's the best explanation of all this data? Like, how can we explain the empty tomb? How do we explain these appearances, the experiences that the disciples had, the 500? So, and that's what we'll do in the next episode. So stay tuned. All right, we are back talking about the evidence for the resurrection. And if you missed the last however many episodes we've done, we did a long excursus into the historical evidence for the resurrection, not just the biblical documents, but non-Christian sources, and then also the archaeological evidence. There's a ton there to look through. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, go back and do it. All right, so now we're talking about different explanations or different theories of the resurrection. What are the different types of theories on offer from skeptics? Also, we obviously, most of us are going to be aware of the Christian explanation that God raised Jesus from the dead. But the first thing that we're going to do in this episode, or this series of episodes, however long it actually ends up being, we're going to talk about the different skeptical theories first, and then at the end we'll talk about basically how the theistic or the Christian hypothesis fares in comparison. So 3 of the most popular theories that are basically dead at this point. There's a conspiracy theory. These are skeptical theories. The conspiracy theory, the wrong tomb theory, and the apparent death theory, or what's also called the swoon theory. So Calum, walk us through some of the reasons that scholars reject pretty much unanimously those 3 different theories.
Yeah, so I think these 3 are pretty much just non-starters. And in a sense, I don't want to say too much about them just because, in a sense, that almost gives it an air of legitimacy that these are actual possible alternatives. So start with the conspiracy theory, that the idea that the disciples stole Jesus's body and then perpetrated this hoax. I think this is pretty much overwhelmingly rejected by scholars for the main reason that the disciples, if they stole Jesus's body, they would know that the resurrection was false. They would know that the resurrection didn't happen. And yet all the evidence we have, the overwhelming evidence, suggests that it's sincere, that they believed in the resurrection, that they really believed Jesus was resurrected. And the evidence of that is that they were willing to go and lose everything. They lose their credibility. They would lose their money. They would lose their families. They would lose their well-being. They would lose their religious honor or their religion kind of as a whole. They would lose often physical comfort. They would lose their lives in many cases. And we have overwhelming evidence of all of this. And
besides, conspiracies don't hold up that long. You know, it's like 12 people that are trying to hold this massive conspiracy together. Someone's going to break. It's going to fall apart at some point.
Right. And so once you have, a group of people who are in on it, you just don't have a group of people who are willing to go through all of that to lose everything for something that they know is false. Now, people often die for things that are false, but that's usually because they're sincerely convinced in something that is false. People don't die for what they know to be false. And people normally lie, or people overwhelmingly lie, for something like power or money or to preserve relationships, or occasionally for a good cause. But in this case, they didn't get any of that. They knew that they weren't going to get power by lying. They knew they weren't going to get money. They knew they weren't going to get any help in their relationships or anything like that. They knew that the only outcome really was horrific persecution and death. And even the idea that they might die for a good cause doesn't make sense in the case of Christianity, because in the case of Christianity, they didn't die saying Jesus taught these morally great things. They said Jesus was the Son of God, and this is built around who he was and his resurrection. And so they knew that if Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, then he wasn't who he said he was. And there's no way they would die for a belief about who Jesus was when they knew that belief about Jesus to be false, and they knew that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. So that's kind of the main reason the conspiracy theory just doesn't hold up at all.
Yeah, and we already talked about a little about the wrong tomb theory and why that's really, really implausible, because basically the tomb was known by the women. Everybody knew where it was. But just run us through that one really quickly, and then we'll go to swoon theory, and then really the only hypothesis that's taken seriously, I think, not only by Christians but by skeptics, is the hallucination hypothesis, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But just again, these last two, wrong tomb, swoon, and then move on.
Sure. So the wrong tomb theory, as you say, most of the reason this is just very implausible is because of the evidence we have for the burial. So the better the evidence we have for the fact that he was buried and that he was buried in a specific place that would be remembered, the less likely it is that they would find the wrong tomb. And as we saw earlier, there's overwhelming evidence, direct historical evidence, as well as background evidence about Jewish burial and about the need to remember where Jesus would have been buried, that suggests that there's no possibility that they would have forgotten where Jesus would have been buried.
And in Luke 23:55, just real quick, it says, the women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph, again, that's Joseph of Arimathea, and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously the fact that it's women who are being given as witnesses there suggests that it wasn't being made up as well. But the other reason on top of that this is extremely implausible is that even if they had managed to go to the wrong tomb, if the disciples had gone to the wrong tomb, it's very likely that other people would have remembered the right tomb. So Joseph would have remembered the right tomb, or Nicodemus would have remembered the right tomb, or even the Sanhedrin might well have known where the tomb was if it was the Sanhedrin's duty to bury criminals. And so even if some of the disciples had found the wrong tomb, it's very likely that the other people involved would have found the right tomb and shown that Jesus was still in there.
I would just add also that basically, any theory, any rival naturalistic theory that's going to really try to comprehensively account for the data has to do more than just account for the empty tomb. It needs to do that, but it does also need, I think, we should all be able to agree that the empty tomb just by itself, if there had been no, apparent appearances of the risen Jesus, would not have, very readily led to a belief in Jesus' resurrection. So any rival explanation which only pertains to the tomb is going to be, very incomplete.
So the next theory on the list is the swoon theory. And this is also sometimes called the apparent death theory. And this basically says that somehow Jesus survived on the cross, despite the fact that the Romans were executioners. He somehow mended his wounds, maybe while in the tomb, maybe with some help, and then very soon afterward came out and basically convinced everyone that he was the risen Lord. Right.
Yes. This is the kind of theory that just to describe it is to refute it, I think. It's just fairly obviously completely crazy. We know that crucifixion is extremely physically demanding, and we know that the treatment Jesus suffered before his crucifixion was extremely physically demanding. And the whole point of the crucifixion was to kill Jesus. And there's no way the Romans, who, like you say, were professional executioners, would have allowed him to die or would have been unable to tell whether he was dead. Now, there is a report that some skeptics sometimes point to that suggests someone can survive crucifixion. But this is someone who was asked by a friend of the Romans to be taken down from the cross and to be given the best medical treatment, essentially, that Rome could offer. And he was taken down after not very long. I think 3 of them were taken down, and only one of them, even then with the best medical treatment, survived. And if you survive that sort of thing, for sure you can survive, but I don't think you can do it on your own. You can't do it without medical treatment, sitting in a tomb without water. You can't roll a big tombstone away from your grave and then go and convince everyone that you've defeated death. If someone had miraculously survived crucifixion, they would need immense medical treatment, or at least a lot of water that you can't get in a tomb. And they would be in a pretty horrific state. They would need to be looked after. They wouldn't go around managing to convince their followers that they had conquered death once and for all and that they were the resurrected Lord of the world.
Swoon theory proponents also sometimes point out that Jesus was actually not on the cross very long. I think it was only like 3 hours, right? Because he was put up on the cross in the afternoon, and then before sunset, he had to have been taken down. So sometimes they'll say, well, like, okay, Jesus wasn't on the cross very long, so it's likely that, maybe he survived his little short stay on the cross.
Yeah, and I mean, I think just the arguments already kind of refute that. I mean, in a sense, it was surprising. We know from the Gospels, some people, I think it was Pilate who was surprised that Jesus had died already, but nevertheless, the Romans could tell when someone had died, and different people do take different times to die. And if you have, immense physical mistreatment before going to crucifixions, if you're flogged a lot, if you lose a lot of blood, in Israel, a hot country, I've been to Israel at Passover, and it's hot. I would have been in serious medical difficulty just from not drinking after a few hours when I went there last spring on an archaeological dig. So the idea that someone could, pass out from being dehydrated even after not very long, and after that sort of mistreatment and that crucifixion, that's not remotely implausible. So I think the fact that he wasn't on the cross for very long is pretty irrelevant when you look at it in the wider context of the soldiers knowing how to kill people and knowing when people were dead.
One of the other things to point out is, just real quick, is the archaeological evidence of Yohanan. I hope I'm saying that right. I don't know really how to say his name, but in there, we have archaeological evidence of a person who was buried, a crucifixion victim, and they have a nail stuck in their heel, like they couldn't get it out of his bone. Imagine trying to walk around with a nail in your foot, through the bone. I don't know. It strains credulity at this point.
I think, yeah. And one other point just to add in terms of how they could certify his death is just that, the way crucifixion kills you is by making it very hard for you to breathe, such that you basically have to push yourself up to keep taking a breath, right? So there's just a very obvious indicator that the Roman soldiers could look for as to whether the person's died, and it's, are they pushing up anymore to take a breath? And if they're not and haven't been doing so for a while, then they're very probably dead.
Yeah, and every time that you have to push up, you have to put weight on your foot, right? And your heel, right, and where the nails are driven through your feet. So it's like every breath that you take is, you're experiencing excruciating pain just to stay alive. And so you can imagine why someone might just give up, because it's so painful. All right, well, so we've discussed those three. Let's move on to the hallucination hypothesis. And this one, very briefly, is basically that the disciples, these 500 brethren, everybody who had experience of Jesus, they didn't actually see anybody. They were having hallucinations. It was all in their minds that they were seeing Jesus. And maybe these were bereavement visions, or that we even have tales of that today, where people claim to see Elvis and people claim to see their loved ones come back from life. But no one really thinks today that these people are actually resurrected or resuscitated or walking around alive. These are just hallucinations. And so this is probably the most popular skeptical explanation of the resurrection, the facts that we've talked about in the first part of this series. So let's dig into this one. I know that, Calum, you've done, and you're continuing to do a lot of work in this area. So let's dig into this one. Where's the best place to start?
Yeah, so with hallucinations, there are kind of a variety of causes for hallucinations typically. And, most ordinarily in psychiatric practice, we'd see them off in the case of psychosis, where you can get psychosis from a number of conditions like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or sometimes really severe depression. Sometimes you can get it from drug use and so on. Obviously, one of the main other causes is just recreational drug use, things like LSD, other hallucinogens. And then sometimes you can actually get hallucinations in people with no psychiatric problems, and particularly in the context of bereavement. And so you can call these grief hallucinations, for example. And these are actually surprisingly common according to studies. Most people don't mention them because they feel unable to talk about them or embarrassed about talking about them, but actually they're reasonably common. There's not a huge load of detail about kind of the age distribution, but certainly they're more common in older people. And we know that the disciples, at least, would have been young at the time, and probably it's likely just given the culture of the time. Even Jesus' mother, who you might think would be the oldest person involved, she was probably, middle-aged by our standards, and so not subject to the kind of cognitive fragility of people in the later stages of life. And so, to begin with, grief hallucinations are common, but they're significantly less common among younger people, such as the disciples. Normally with grief hallucinations, especially if they're as common as scientists seem to think they are, it seems like people who would be prone to them would have experience of them and would know them, and certainly people in the community would know of them, especially if they are prevalent among younger people, as they would need to be in order to explain the appearances in this case. And obviously, being a common feature of the ancient world, if people said that someone who had died and people who were distressed at the death of someone they had loved, if those people began claiming that the person in question had risen from the dead and that they'd seen him, it would be a fairly obvious suggestion that these were just visions. Visions were well known in the ancient world, and they would use certain terminology. They would say they were exalted, or they were in Abraham's bosom, or just that they had a vision. And we see this in Revelation, where John in Revelation has this vision of Jesus, and they were well aware of visions in the ancient world, and lots of Greco-Roman stories that talk about heroes in the past, or novels in Greco-Roman literature, they will talk about characters having visions, and these were fairly well known. But they wouldn't have necessarily said that this was a resurrection specifically. I think in order to explain the terminology of resurrection, it had to have been something considerably more concrete. And we know that the overwhelming majority of grief hallucinations are generally just of one sensory modality. So they will be either visual, in which case they just see someone who doesn't talk, or they will be auditory, where they hear someone but they don't see them. Or I think about 1% of cases, I'm not sure the exact details, but I think it's 1% of cases are tactile, which means that they feel something. So this is pretty rare that they would feel something in a grief hallucination. And it's much, much rarer still that they would have all of these at the same time, that they would be able to see and hear someone and touch them. Now, that's not to say it's impossible. And given the frequency with which grief hallucinations occur, it is plausible that other times in history, there have been people who have experienced hallucinations in more than one sensory modality, and particularly people who are vulnerable to those sorts of hallucinations, such as particularly old people or perhaps particularly young people. As I say, the science isn't especially clear on all these details, but one would think that those demographic groups would be the most vulnerable to it.
I have a quick question for clarification. Would
Sure.
a grief hallucination represent a mental illness?
In a sense, it's a semantic question. I don't think we'd normally say it was a mental illness. We would say they occur in psychiatrically well individuals, and they're just kind of a one-off thing that just happens. I mean, in a sense, it could be, you could say it was kind of a brief, acute kind of psychiatric symptom, but it's not normally characterized as kind of mental illness.
Okay, and so far you're basically saying that grief hallucinations is what you're saying is that the grief hallucination is the most plausible candidate of a type of hallucination to
Right,
explain.
exactly.
Okay.
So I think the other cases are just complete non-starters. So if they were using a hallucinogen, they would have known that they were using a hallucinogen. And it doesn't seem like they describe Jesus in a way that you would expect from hallucinogenic drugs, where people normally see extremely eccentric things and visually stimulating things and bright colors and distorted shapes and that sort of thing. They describe Jesus as fairly simple and recognizable. They don't talk of pink elephants and things like that. So hallucinogens is a non-starter for explaining hallucinations in their case. And psychosis, I think, is another non-starter. I mean, the idea that they would all just suddenly have the onset of a psychotic illness completely independently, that they would all just suddenly get schizophrenia or bipolar, is probabilistically verging on impossible. We never say impossible, but it's probabilistically a non-starter as well, I think.
Yeah, the prior probability of that seems pretty low.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and of course, we have evidence that they didn't have these things, because people with those illnesses exhibit many other symptoms that we have no evidence for in the disciples, and we have significant evidence against. So I think that's essentially impossible as well. So when we're talking about grief hallucinations, this is just the only sort of plausible candidate for the kind of hallucinations that could explain it.
And define that real quickly, just one last time. What is specifically, like, lay it out? What is a grief hallucination?
So there may be a technical definition that I don't know exactly. So I'm not intending to speak as an authority defining it here, but it would be essentially a hallucination, which is a kind of sensory experience of something that isn't there. So it's something essentially that the mind makes up. It's not just an illusion where they missee something or misinterpret something they have seen. It's something that they experience either visually or auditory or tactile that literally isn't there and that has no external stimulus at all. It would be a hallucination just in the context of grief, which is usually bereavement. So, for example, after Jesus' death, it would more likely be a grief hallucination as the disciples were bereaved.
Here's another question. Yeah. So in these cases, I don't know how many you've looked at particularly, but in these cases, is it likely that for the person who experiences a grief hallucination, do they normally go on after that believing that that person is alive again? Or do they normally like have this experience and then recognize, oh, well, that was just a hallucination, that wasn't real?
Yeah, so this is critically important, I think. So if you look at these cases, then there may be a case that I'm not aware of where they do genuinely go on and think that this person is alive again, but I'm not aware of any such cases. And the studies seem to suggest overwhelmingly these people have insight, and insight in psychiatry means they're aware that what they're experiencing is pathological or is not real.
Yeah, at some point your rational faculties kick in and you're like, okay, what I'm seeing with my eyes or what I'm feeling in my hands, this is not real. This is just something that's going on in my brain. Eventually you'd come to recognize, for most rational people, you'd come to recognize that this was not a real thing that happened.
Yeah. And I think overwhelmingly that's the case with grief hallucinations.
All right, so where do we go from here in like responding to this explanation of the experiences that the disciples had? One thing to bear in mind is that this is not an explanation of the empty tomb, the hallucination hypothesis. So if we had something like this, a successful hallucination hypothesis, we'd need to combine it with some explanation as to why there's an empty tomb there too. So yeah, right.
That's right. A comprehensive naturalistic explanation would need not only to be able to account for the appearances, but also the empty tomb. Now, I guess I'm inclined to think that that's not necessarily like a massive extra burden, in the sense that like it's not too difficult to imagine a scenario where the tomb is emptied for some reason. Let's say, like, I think the wrong tomb hypothesis is effectively ruled out, but I don't think we can really firmly rule out something like, a random grave robber. Well, unlikely though it is, I don't think it's impossible. Or that, for some reason, Joseph of Arimathea decided to move Jesus to a more permanent resting place or something like that. And then that upon the, discovery of the tomb empty by the women, that was kind of the trigger for these grief visions or whatever. At least that's what I would say if I was a naturalist.
Yeah, my only thought there is that we'd have to really specify like what the theory is, because only at that point can we actually start to analyze how this matches up to the resurrection hypothesis. And so I think that once you do that, you're going to start to find some holes, and you're going to have to fill the whole theory out. And I think that's one of the things that Calum mentions I forget where he mentions this, but once you actually start to like flesh it out, you're going to start to see like improbabilities stack up and stack up and stack up. But my only point for mentioning that was that the hallucination hypothesis can't be the whole story. So you'd have to you'd have to combine it with something else, whether or not that's difficult or not. This isn't the whole story, but it is a big chunk of the story. It explains, or it's meant to explain like why there was such this drastic change in the disciples and whatnot. And this is one of the most difficult things to explain. Oh, and then I should also mention that, again, this is why some skeptical historians, skeptics online, this is one of the reasons why they tried to push against the fact of the empty tomb, because if there is no fact of the empty tomb, then basically all you need to do is come up with the hallucination hypothesis. So I think where we're trying to go from here is in responding to the grief hallucination hypothesis and just sort of analyzing it, reflecting on whether or not it's a good hypothesis of the data. So from here, who wants to chip in at this point? Should we go to you, Max? Or you?
I can say something briefly in that. So, I mean, as you probably picked up already, this is probably the bit where Calum and I might diverge the most, which might also make it more interesting than the previous bits. I mean, like I've said before, I think like the case for the resurrection depends upon like considerable background evidence for thinking that this person in particular is someone that is likely to be raised from the dead. And so, yeah, and I guess I don't think that, like, I'm basically less confident than some people that we can like very strongly rule out something like a kind of grief hallucination hypothesis with perhaps some kind of contagion or hysteria, and then perhaps some false memories which start to crystallize over time. Something like that doesn't, like, I'm not saying I think it like very easily explains all the evidence, but at the same time, in your first show with Calum, you talked about the Bayes factor, right? Which is the ratio, like how strongly does the resurrection hypothesis predict the evidence versus how strong does the hypothesis that there was no resurrection predict the evidence? And for me, at least, I'm not inclined to think that it's like overwhelmingly huge. And so, yeah, I guess what I would say, if I was a naturalist, I think probably the best shot would be something like this. As you said, we need to sort of account for the empty tomb. I mean, I think you would have to just posit some kind of tomb robbery by persons unknown, or perhaps Joseph of Arimathea moved it for some reason. All of which is unlikely, but at the same time, if I'm a naturalist, I'm thinking a bodily resurrection is about as unlikely a thing as there could be. So grave robbery by persons unknown, and then in combination with something like, a very powerful grief hallucination by Peter, and perhaps, some of the others have some kind of experience as well. Perhaps it's like encouraged by the report from Peter. And as time goes on, a sort of story grows up of this experience that they all had together. And, we know that false memories can become cemented over time in a community if a story is told enough times. And yeah, so I guess that's roughly how that would be like, I think, the best shot that a naturalist has. And as I said, I don't think that one can say that that's like outlandishly improbable.
All right, well, let's turn it over to Calum, because obviously, and you already mentioned this, Calum disagrees. I think he thinks that the strength of the evidence is extremely good. It's somewhere on the magnitude of between, I think it was Richard Swinburne thinks that the Bayes factor is about, 1,000? And Timothy McGrew thinks it's about 10 to the 44, which is, a big number. And so Calum, in our two-part series on the prior probability of the resurrection, was saying that he falls somewhere between that figure. So obviously that's a big difference between you guys. So Calum, where do you disagree with what Max just basically laid out? And he thinks that the explanation that he gave, the naturalistic explanation, doesn't seem too improbable. I mean, it's unlikely, but it's not too improbable. So where do you disagree with him?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing I'd say is that, you can build a strong case for the resurrection with a Bayes factor anywhere between what Swinburne says at 1,000 or what the McGrews say at 10 to the power of 44. And, if there's good evidence for God through natural theology, and if Jesus is the kind of person that God would raise, as Swinburne kind of shows, you don't need a huge Bayes factor at all to make a solid case for the resurrection. So he does it with just 1,000. And I think Max would put it at a significantly higher number than Swinburne even. So both of us think, the evidence is strong. It's just a question of when you get to these enormous numbers, in a sense, the kind of qualitative terminology doesn't really help in a sense, because some people would say a base factor of 1,000,000, that's really strong evidence. But, compared to a base factor of 1,000,000,000, it's not as strong, if you see what I mean. And so I think both of us would say it's strong evidence, and it's not, it's far from easy to explain. I think, like you say, and like Max suggests, I do think the evidence is stronger. And I think, in a sense, there's always going to be a possible naturalistic explanation. And, Christians have long said this. They've always said, even if the resurrection did occur, there could be a naturalistic explanation through quantum physics, that sort of thing, that I don't really understand very well. So, there's always going to be a very improbable possible alternative.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be pejorative, but there's also the possible explanation of like aliens coming down and
right.
causing ruckus on Earth just to get a kick out of it.
Yeah, and I think probably most people would say that's more plausible than the quantum explanation for the resurrection. Real
quick, let's back up a second and talk about because we mentioned the Bayes factor, and if you listen to those 2 episodes we did on the prior probability, you're going to have a basic understanding of what that is. But Calum, if you can just lay that out real quick, take about 5 minutes to explain like what a Bayes factor is, why that's important. And then after that, let's move back and talk about the grief hallucinations.
Yeah, sure. So just quickly, a Bayes factor, as Max said, is essentially a measure of the strength of the evidence. And using probability theory, you can kind of quantify, or you can apply a measure for the strength of some evidence. And the way you do that is by comparing how likely is it that you would get this data or this evidence if the theory is true, and compare that with how likely is it that you would get this data or evidence if the theory is false. And the Bayes factor is just the ratio between them. So if the probability of the evidence given the theory is 1, and the probability of the evidence given the negation or the falsehood of the theory is 0.1, or 0.1 as you guys would say, the Bayes factor would be 10. Or if the probabilities are 1 and 0.01, the Bayes factor would be 100, and so on. And often in science, you can get enormous Bayes factors. So when we posit these big numbers, we're not being especially outlandish. Lots of scientific evidence would have Bayes factors of millions or billions or so on. So this isn't kind of crazy or outlandish here. But it is quite difficult to explain in purely qualitative terms when you just say, how good is the evidence? Good or very good or excellent, that kind of thing.
So it's a comparison between, like, you already mentioned the hypothesis, how well the hypothesis, and in our case, we're talking about the resurrection, the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead, how well that explains or makes likely the evidence that we see, talking about the crucifixion, the empty tomb, the appearances, versus like the naturalistic explanations of how well those explain the data or make the data likely. So we're basically comparing these two and saying, well, where does the evidence weigh? Is it more expected on the theistic hypothesis, or is it more expected on the naturalistic hypothesis, or the negation, if you want to say, the negation of the resurrection hypothesis? And so that requires like looking at both of them. You got to see, well, how likely is it that if God raised Jesus from the dead, we'd have a crucifixion, a death, a burial, a empty tomb appearances, versus how likely is it that we'd expect all those things, on some naturalistic theory, like the hallucination hypothesis combined with a random grave robber, for instance. So that's basically what we're doing at this point, and we've only looked at the naturalistic side of things.
Yeah, and so it kind of makes intuitive sense, because if you think about what good evidence for a scientific theory is, it's basically when a scientific theory predicts something that otherwise would be really, really surprising. So when you look at kind of the theory of common descent between humans and animals, and the theory of evolution by natural selection, you find evidence like a fossil, for example, and you think, well, this seems kind of fairly easy to explain, or it's predicted by the theory of evolution because it shows kind of similarities or like an intermediate kind of feature between humans and animals. But this is really surprising if evolution isn't true, because why would there just be this fossil that shows kind of an intermediate stage between humans and animals if evolution didn't happen, or if we didn't have a common ancestor, that kind of thing. And any kind of scientific discovery or piece of scientific evidence can be characterized in this way. It's something that's surprising if the theory is false, but not that surprising if the theory is true. And so the question here is, with the resurrection, just how surprising is this data if the resurrection didn't happen? And the strength of the evidence for the resurrection will depend on just how surprising it is. So the evidence we have is not at all surprising if the resurrection happened, because if the resurrection happened, you'd expect Jesus' tomb to be empty with virtual certainty. And you might reasonably expect that he'd appear to his closest followers, who he promised that he would lead into the kingdom and recreate Israel with, that sort of thing. And you might expect him to appear to his family again and that sort of thing. So it's not very surprising, even if you can't absolutely predict it with complete precision. But it seems very surprising. And again, you can sort of get a probabilistic measure on this, and that's how you generate the Bayes factor, by saying, what is the chance that this would happen if Jesus didn't rise from the dead? And then you have to work out that probability by saying, what's the probability that Jesus's tomb would be found empty if Jesus didn't rise from the dead? Well, that's just going to be the probability that Jesus' tomb would be empty by adding up the probabilities of all the possible explanations of that, like grave robbery, or the disciples robbing it, or the authorities robbing it. And if all of those are unlikely, then the probability of the empty tomb in general is going to be unlikely. And then you multiply that again by the probability that you would get these reports of Jesus appearing to people, and see how unlikely that would be. And so when you take it back to grief hallucinations, again, Max and I will disagree about just how unlikely that would be. And it can be a bit complicated, because you can get these sort of hybrid theories, which I would agree with Max are the most plausible alternative explanations. I don't think they're very plausible at all. I think maybe if there was no religious background to Jesus' ministry and there was no reason to think God would raise him from the dead, and so the resurrection had a very low prior probability, I would probably agree with Max and say one of these is probably the case. But in the context of Jesus' ministry and the claims he made about himself and everything else we know about him and about God, I think the resurrection theory is far more probable as an explanation. And one of the things, so just a few of the things that I think make grief hallucinations really improbable in this case is, firstly, they occurred in young people who are far less prone to hallucinations and cognitive kind of malfunctioning. People with grief hallucinations usually have insight, so they know that the person hasn't been raised from the dead, and they realize that it was just a hallucination in the end. Grief hallucinations are usually negative experiences, so they usually don't involve stirring people up with hope or with joy, as we see in the Gospels and as we see in early Christianity. They're normally experienced by individuals, and the more people you add to the hallucination at the same time, the more unlikely it gets. And to get a group hallucination with 12 people, I think, I at least haven't seen any reliable accounts of that, although Max might have done. And as I say, they're more likely in people who are lonely, unlike the disciples. They're more likely in people who are older. They're more likely in people who have memory problems and that sort of thing. And normally the appearances stop when the grief stops as well. So normally when people stop grieving, as the disciples would have done once they started believing in the resurrection after the first appearance or so, the appearances would stop, because the appearances are directly related to the grief and the mental stress that's going through the mind at that time. But we know in the gospel accounts that the appearances didn't stop at that time. They carried on even when the disciples were very happy.
So here's something I'm thinking about, going back to, I want to ask Max this question. So when we're thinking about like a plausible naturalistic explanation, the hallucination is not just like any hallucination. It's a kind of transformative event that transforms these disciples into boldly going out and making Christian disciples. And so I guess the question there is like, the hallucination might explain the experience of seeing Jesus, but what explains, or like what can we add? What can we like hybrid out this naturalistic explanation even further to give some kind of explanation as to why this event was transformative in this way? Because that's, I think, one of the points that you made, Calum, is that there's, in conjunction with just like having this hallucination, there's this transformative nature of this one, which it's like positive. It's a positive transformation that doesn't really happen in these types of scenarios. So like, what could we add a naturalistic hypothesis to explain like why it was so transformative.
I mean, I guess you're going to have to say that the disciples were their kind of hopes were so set on Jesus as the Redeemer of Israel that they, in a sense, kind of had to find a way to carry on because they'd invested so much of their lives into it up until that point at which he was crucified, that in a sense, like all of that was wasted unless they could find a way to say that it was actually a good thing. I mean, I guess, yeah, I guess that's the sort of line you would have to go down in order to start being able to explain how it has this incredible kind of missionary impulse.
Calum, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing that I was going to say about grief hallucinations is that normally grief is worse after, so it normally makes things worse, partly because they're usually negative experiences. And so kind of, you know, I said before that I agree with Max that this is possible, or at least that some sort of hybrid is possible, where maybe one person has a grief hallucination and then it sort of spreads in some way to the others. I don't think, you know, I mean, in general, hallucinations aren't contagious, but there's at least a possibility that it primed someone else too. I think it's unlikely that all of them had grief hallucinations, and so I don't think it would be reasonable to propose that. But
it can't just be a grief hallucination. It's got to be a grief hallucination plus being convinced that this hallucination was like a real thing, right? So like it can't just be
So it has to be a rare kind of grief hallucination.
Yeah.
So it would be, so normally grief hallucinations are negative, that people have insight and that sort of thing. That even if it was just one person that you needed to propose having a hallucination here, you would still have to say it would be a rare kind of grief hallucination, because it would be one that would be very uncharacteristic. And then obviously the more people you want to say had that kind of grief hallucination, the less probable the theory is going to get. But you can maybe, bolster the theory a bit by saying, well, maybe they didn't all have to have grief hallucinations. Maybe some of them just ended up with false memories or ended up in some sort of mass hysteria or something. I think that the data on these sorts of theories is fairly slim, and I'm yet to see kind of a clear parallel case that could be convincing. So even if you think this sort of thing is possible or like precedented in human history, perhaps it is. Perhaps there are other kinds of things which are similar on the kind of scale in terms of the evidence and in terms of the impossibility of naturalistic hypotheses or the improbability of naturalistic hypotheses. It might be that does happen, a few times in recorded history on this scale. But even if that's the case, you have to say that they're extraordinarily rare, and that the chances of it just happening to any random person who died at any given point in time is a very slim probability. It's going to be one in a large number. And as long as that's the case, you don't have to say that these other explanations are absolutely impossible, or even that they're completely you don't even have to say that they're unprecedented from the Christian point of view. You just have to say they're sufficiently rare that the evidence is very strong. And I think we can say that about the resurrection. I think it does involve a lot of improbabilities to try and get the evidence that we do actually have, even if these sorts of things do have some kind of precedent.
Yeah, I guess I Max, I'm gonna have to push back on you a little bit, buddy. I just can't see why the evidence would be expected at all on a naturalistic hypothesis. And I'm not just saying that. I'm not saying it's why would it be expected. I'm saying I can't see why the Bayes factor wouldn't be massive in the case of the evidence that we have. I just can't pull myself away from agreeing with Calum on this.
So yeah, I don't know. I mean, so remember that my claim is that, like, if there are good arguments for the prior probability being very low, then the direct evidence isn't strong enough to overcome that. And so, like, obviously it's sort of vague what I mean by very low, but I guess I'm a bit closer on the spectrum to Swinburne. So yeah, how would I defend that? I mean, I guess I would just defend that by saying, like, I think, like, we have enough experience of human beings being susceptible, especially under conditions where there's, a strong kind of religious atmosphere and particular kinds of expectations surrounding a certain figure, that, it just doesn't seem like outlandish to me that you could get some kind of, you would need one person to begin the sort of chain reaction, if you will, by having perhaps, let's grant an unusual kind of grief hallucination, which is particularly powerful and vivid and so on. But like, again, nothing that Calum has said has shown, I don't think, that kind of thing is like infinitesimally unlikely. And then, for some of the others to have some kind of experience, or at least to end up convinced, in ways that you like certainly can observe, like in the modern world, where a group of people are kind of primed to start believing that a certain thing happened, and over time memories kind of get rewritten, that kind of thing. I just don't think that if I was a naturalist, I just can't see how I would think that a bodily resurrection is more probable than the kind of thing I've just sketched. Even if, like, and I grant the kind of thing I've sketched doesn't, like, obviously just tie up all the loose ends very neatly, but, like, again, we're talking about a scenario where, like, assume that the prior probability of a bodily resurrection is fantastically low. I just can't see how it's plausible to say that, some kind of conjunction of grief hallucination plus mass hysteria plus random grave theft is less likely than the way a naturalist thinks, of the probability of a bodily resurrection.
Yeah, this is helpful. I think that it might be helpful to make that distinction once again between the prior probability and the posterior, not the posterior, but the prior probability versus the Bayes factor. And it sounds to me like what you're saying is that the evidence is somewhat nominal. It's somewhat weighs in favor of the resurrection hypothesis, but it all depends. It goes back to that prior probability, which I think that you would agree is not too low, right? As a Christian.
Well, I think that, absolutely. So I think that's why I'm very much in sympathy with Swinburne's approach in terms of trying to first build a case for thinking. And to be clear, you don't need to show that God does exist. You don't need to show it's more likely than not. You just need to show it's like, at least sort of, I don't know, 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100. And then when you start to throw in some stuff about, how might God kind of respond to the human situation, and does any particular human figure in history look like a good candidate for the sort of person that God would act through to bring about some kind of rescue of humanity? Jesus, I think, looks like by far the best candidate. So yeah, I think that there's a strong case for thinking that the prior probability is moderate at least, and so that's why I just don't think you need the direct evidence, the Bayes factor, to be all that strong.
And okay, so Calum, just to lay it all out again, Calum thinks the Bayes factor is a lot larger, and so even with the lower a prior probability that's like infinitesimally small, could still, the evidence is so strong that it could still overcome that. And that's basically the way that we end up with the posterior probability after we looked at all the evidence, that it's more likely than not, and depending on, like, what you set these numbers at, that's how we're getting at a posterior probability that Jesus rose from the dead. So do you guys have anything else to add there before I go on to different questions?
Yeah, I guess I would just clarify. I don't think if the prior probability was infinitesimally small, the evidence would be good enough, just because the evidence has only a finite probabilistic strength. So like the evidence, it does have some limit. And I think it's probably even less than Tim and Lydia McGrew's estimate of 10 to the power of 44. So I don't know where I'd put it. And to be honest, I'd quite like to just do some calculations and see where I come up with, because we know that humans are prone to misestimating these sorts of Bayes factors. Unless they
in the end, you might even be farther.
It might be, yeah. So humans are actually prone to underestimating Bayes factors. So if I were to just give a guess, then it might be wrong. And so I think it's the sort of thing that probably just needs a bit more calculating and working through. But I would think I would end up at less than what Tim and Lydia suggest. So less than 10 to the power of 44. But that's still, immensely strong. Even if it's 10 to the power of 10 or 10 to the power of 15, that's still very strong. And as long as the prior probability is more than 1 in 10 to the power of 15, i.e. as long as the prior probability is more than 1 in billions and billions, then the resurrection comes out, well confirmed, which is fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add one more thing, which is I've tried to my best to reflect on how I guess I've alluded to this a little bit before, but how would I view this evidence pertaining to the empty tomb and the appearances if it was just for some other random figure in history about whom we knew nothing else? And I guess the conclusion I come to is that I would just be agnostic about what happened. I would think that something weird happened, but I would probably just leave it at that. And so, yeah, if I'm going to be consistent, then I think I have to say that would be what my position would be about this evidence as it pertains to Jesus, were it not for the background considerations about God and the kind of person Jesus was.
So this is a question to either one of you. What objection have you seen to the resurrection? And this is, I'm looking for something that you see like on a regular basis. What is one of the worst objections that you've seen to the resurrection?
Oh, yes, I'll say, I think it's probably the objection that Jesus, if he had really risen from the dead, he would have appeared to famous people like the Roman emperor or Pontius Pilate. And the fact that he didn't is supposed to be evidence against the resurrection.
What about you, Calum?
I actually haven't heard that one. The one that actually came to mind is probably a bit pejorative because it's actually a very common and prestigious one. But Hume's argument, I just think is so palpably miserable. I just can't believe anyone of any intellectual power. I mean, Hume was intelligent. Hume was a very good philosopher and a very intelligent person. And I honestly can't see how he ever found that remotely convincing.
Just remind us what that is real quick, Hume's objection.
So it's essentially the idea that because, the idea of miracles and resurrections are basically unprecedented in human history, therefore all the evidence of, scientific laws of the past goes against a miracle occurring. And therefore, even if there was really, really good evidence for a miracle, it would at best only match the universal evidence of human experience beforehand. And so they would cancel out. And so you still, at best, you could just be agnostic about a miracle. But that's the best case scenario. And then he argues further that you don't have the best case scenario because he says things like miracles are usually held to have happened by barbarians in barbarous nations and gullible people, and that people are prone to lying and things like that. Obviously, there are going to be some other very outlandish arguments that are probably just as bad or worse. Things like, people who claim that Jesus never existed, or people who think that resurrections happened in other kind of cultures in the Mediterranean at that time, and who think that it has precedent in earlier mythical stories and things like that. Those are the kinds of things I don't think any serious historian would accept. But to some extent, they're so outlandish that they're not worth mentioning. But yeah, I think all of those are pretty miserable. Okay, so we're wrapping up our discussion. Max, did you want to say something?
No, I was just laughing about Calum using the word miserable.
So we're wrapping up our discussion. If either one of you can just give a brief summary of pretty much, I'm asking a big thing here. If you could just give a summary of kind of what we've talked about, not only in this part, but in both parts, and maybe you can go back and forth, and maybe Max can take the historical evidence, and then Calum, you can wrap it up and explain why you think that the resurrection, wins ultimately in the end. And then after that, I want to talk about your new book for about 10 minutes or so, your new book that you guys co-wrote and just are going to release pretty soon here. So I want to dedicate some time to that book, because this podcast series is actually being released somewhat in conjunction with that book. So it's really exciting stuff.
Yeah, okay. So I'll just kind of summarize what we discussed in terms of the evidence. So, yeah, we started sort of talking about non-Christian sources like Josephus, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, Marabas, Serapion, late first century or early second century sources, which all essentially kind of attest the core backbone, if you like, of the events of Jesus' ministry and also his crucifixion. And then at least they give us a very kind of zoomed out picture of this movement that had followed Jesus, sort of stopped for a bit after he died, but then it kind of came back with a vengeance, if you like, and that is intriguing to say the least. And then we sort of went on to talk about how then we can start to bring in various Christian sources, which we're treating here just as ordinary historical sources, not presupposing that they're divinely inspired or anything, just to be evaluated with the normal tools of historical research. And yeah, so we especially important is this early creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which virtually all historians think Paul received very early on, within maybe 5 years of the events of Jesus' crucifixion and so on. And Paul received this from the eyewitnesses themselves. Yeah, so from there we went on to talk about so the crucifixion is very well established, and you even have ancient historians saying it's sort of about as well established as anything in ancient history is. The burial, Calum talked a lot about the Jewish background, the importance of burying the dead. Also the archaeology, which suggests that an authentic memory of the site of Jesus' burial actually was preserved and has been preserved up until the present day, and how the details of it fit quite well with the Gospels' descriptions. I talked about how Joseph of Arimathea, who the Gospels say carried out the burial, is very likely to be an authentic figure. And then we talked about the empty tomb, the unlikelihood of using women as the primary witnesses, and sort of went through a couple of the and this line of argument, I would say, is probably accepted by the majority of historians today. There is a little bit of pushback, people trying to say that, well, maybe there are reasons. Actually, this claim that it would be really awkward to use women, maybe that's not so secure, or perhaps they had to use women for some reason, the male disciples fleeing or whatever. And we just looked at those a bit and suggested actually, in the end, it remains a strong consideration that these accounts of the empty tomb being attested by the women is not something that the early church would be likely to invent. There was no need for them to kind of hamstring themselves like that. Then we went on to talking about the appearances. And so, yeah, some of those appearances are strongly multiply attested, which is to say they're mentioned in several independent sources. And the appearance to the 12 is probably the best attested of them all. But also, the appearance to James, which is not really doubted by any historian, and the appearance to Paul, both quite interesting, given that these seem to have been people who didn't start out sympathetic to Jesus. And indeed, the appearances to these two individuals appears to be what actually convinced them to become followers of Jesus. And then also the appearance of the 500, very intriguing. And Paul seems to be kind of vouching for it and willing to say that, you could actually go and talk to these people because some of them are still alive, which is pretty interesting, and suggests that Paul, was confident that these people would have a compelling account to give. And also we talked about the Jewish background more broadly in terms of what resurrection meant. And it clearly seemed to mean something that happened to a corpse. It clearly seemed to be a physical event, even if the resurrection body had, properties that are quite unlike the original body. Nonetheless, there seems to be this continuity in Jewish thought, and in Paul's thought. Clearly, there is this continuity between the mortal body and the resurrection body. But what's really interesting is that all of the Old Testament allusions to a future resurrection at the end of time are to an event where everyone, or at least all of the righteous of Israel, will be raised up on the last day. And there's really no conception at all that one individual, not even the Messiah, will be raised to eternal life before Judgment Day, which is what makes it very striking that the early Christians, when, particularly given that there's lots of different categories available to first century Jews for talking about the fate of the dead, including, exaltation, as Calum said, being in the bosom of Abraham and so on, or even, being a ghost. That seems to be a category that they had. And yet they don't reach for any of these readily available categories. They reach for this very specific category, which up until then everyone had thought was reserved for this event at the end of time. And they say that this event that everyone thought was going to just happen at the end of time has now happened to this one man in isolation while history is still going on. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers it in terms of what we discussed with the direct historical evidence.
Turning it over to you, Calum. After we looked at the historical evidence, we then turned to what are the best explanations, or what are the possible alternative, and not just possible, right? We have to look at something that's moderately something that's on the table, like a live explanation. So we looked at a couple of naturalistic explanations, and then we looked at the most realistic one, and then we kind of drew it together. So Calum, why don't you give a brief summary, and then I do want to discuss your book.
Yeah, sure. So we discussed a few that I think were just non-starters completely from the beginning. So conspiracy theory, the idea that the disciples stole Jesus' body from the tomb. It doesn't explain the appearances in the first place, including appearances to people like Paul, who wouldn't have been involved. It makes no sense given that the disciples were evidently sincere from the fact that they gave up everything in their life to follow Jesus. So we know that the disciples were sincere in their belief. So we know that this is just virtually impossible as a theory. Another one that, again, seems virtually impossible is the swoon theory, which says that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. We noted that this is almost unprecedented kind of in the history of crucifixions. We know that there was one person who was taken down from a cross and survived. But even when he was taken down and given the best medical treatment that Rome could offer, only one of the three people taken down survived. When you look at the case of Jesus, who they wanted to kill, no one asked him to be taken down and given medical treatment. He was taken down, put in a tomb where he'd have no access to any water for a few days. He'd have to somehow manage to roll the stone from his tomb back, which would be extremely heavy and probably take a couple of people. And he would then have to somehow convince people that he defeated death and that he was the glorious resurrected Christ, which, again, I don't think any scholar would take seriously these days. And then there was the idea of the wrong tomb theory. And we said that the evidence for the burial is the one that is the material that mostly militates against this theory, just because we know that people were buried. We know that criminals in particular were buried. And we know that they'd have every motivation for knowing exactly where Jesus was buried. And indeed, it seems like we even have the evidence today of where he was buried. So the idea that they would have just not remembered the right tomb or gone to the wrong one seems very unlikely from the context and from the direct historical evidence. But also, even if they had gone to the wrong one, it doesn't seem to make much sense, because someone would have remembered where the right one was, either Joseph of Arimathea or the rest of the Sanhedrin, who had a vested interest in not letting the idea of a resurrection start, and who wanted Jesus to be buried as part of their religious custom. And so even if the disciples had gone to the wrong tomb, Joseph or the Sanhedrin or someone else would have found the right tomb, produced Jesus' body, and shown that he wasn't risen from the dead. So these are all non-starters. There was one theory which Max alluded to, which we didn't have time to cover, which is the idea that some random grave robbers stole the body. we can talk about that another time. We could do an article or a small podcast about it. But again, I think there are reasons that militate against that as well. So that's kind of the summary. And then we talked about slightly more live theories like the hallucination theory. And the idea here is that hallucinations, and again, the only live candidate here is grief hallucinations rather than acute psychosis or substance use. And we saw that for a number of reasons, even for this just to occur in one person, the kind of grief hallucination that you would need to cause this belief and that gives rise to these sorts of recorded narratives would have to be an extremely unusual kind of grief hallucination, even just to happen to one person. And for that to happen to multiple people multiplies that improbability exponentially, I think. You can have some kind of hybrid theory where maybe one person has a grief hallucination and then somehow this belief spreads to the other people through the implantation of false memories or suggestions. But I think the idea that you would get enough people on board with that and enough people so convinced of Jesus' resurrection that they would go to their deaths and go through such heavy persecution, I think you would have to end up in what would be a very, very improbable theory. But there is some room for disagreement, as you will have noticed, between me and Max on that. But I think it is a theory that is extremely improbable. And if you have a good alternative explanation, one that makes sense, one that's a simple theory which predicts the evidence, which makes sense of Jesus's ministry and which makes sense of natural theology and the idea that God would want to reveal himself to the world, I think we have that theory in the resurrection. And when you place those two theories side by side, whether you think the hallucination theory or the hybrid theory is almost infinitesimally improbable or just, considerably improbable, when you compare that to a theory that actually predicts the evidence perfectly well, is a simple theory that doesn't have to postulate anything ad hoc, that just says God exists, God wanted to reveal himself to humans, and God happened to pick the person who is probably the most famous, widely revered moral teacher in human history, where almost every religion in the world wants to claim him as their own prophet. It doesn't seem crazy to me that God would pick that person to reveal himself through. And given that Jesus seemed to make those claims about himself, that seems by far the best theory to me. So that would be the summary of the possible explanations.
Awesome. So let's take about 5 minutes. And Max, I know that you've got to leave soon. So if you've got to pop out, that's totally fine. I'm sure that Calum can cover for you. But tell me about this book that you're writing. It's on the reliability of the New Testament. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right. So basically, this book grew out of a popular level talk that Calum and I wrote, I guess, about a year ago now, where we just had this idea for how you can present the evidence in a way that's quite sort of memorable and has a fairly appealing and intuitive structure to it. And so, in a sense, like the content of the book is entirely unoriginal. But the thing that we think is helpful is just this way of structuring it that we're using. And so roughly the idea is this: you think in terms of a series of concentric circles, right? And in the outermost circle, you have the question: is the world that the New Testament depicts, the Gospels and Acts primarily, I guess, is the world a real world? Which is to say, are the places real? Are the landmarks real? Are the customs real? Is the kind of political and religious atmosphere real? And it seems like the answer to that is yes. And I suppose archaeology is very relevant here in terms of corroborating, the places, but not only the places, but also the customs and the general kind of way of life that existed in first century Palestine. And then, of course, also non-Christian sources like Josephus, Tacitus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, very important sources for filling out our knowledge of what the political and religious climate of first century Judea was like. And again, it seems like there's a very good fit here between the kind of world that is depicted in the Gospels, the kinds of issues that Jesus is arguing with religious leaders about. This all fits kind of hand in glove with what we learn about the climate of first century Palestine from non-Christian sources like Josephus. So that already is going some way towards establishing the reliability of the gospel accounts. But then we can ask a question, so even if these accounts are set in a real time and place, you can still have fictional stories that are set in a vividly real time and place. Now, already though, the fact that the world is so kind of well and accurately depicted in the Gospels and Acts, that already takes us quite a long way, because of the fact that there just doesn't really seem to be a genre of realistic fiction in the ancient world. But nonetheless, we can still ask, at least from a modern perspective, we would typically ask, okay, so this story is set in a real time and place with a real political climate and so on, but are the people who are mentioned in the story real? And so there we can look to non-Christian sources which attest particular individuals in the Gospels and Acts. Not least Jesus, but also other figures like James, Jesus's brother, Pontius Pilate, Herod, and so on. And there's plenty of evidence from just outside the New Testament that these characters were real. But then also we can ask about the authenticity of the minor characters. So about 100 named Jewish characters in the Gospels and Acts in total. And so this is where, the stuff we were talking about earlier with Richard Baucham's work on the fact that the patterns of popularity of names in the Gospels matches so well with the relative popularity of names as we know it from archaeological sources, indicating the authenticity of almost all, or if not all, the named characters. But then, we can still go on to ask a further question. Are the events in which these characters are situated, are these real events? Because, you can still have stories which involve real characters in a real time and place that are still fictional stories. And so that's where we turn to, well, firstly, the evidence from the non-Christian sources attesting this sort of core backbone of the events of Jesus' ministry, his reputation as a healer, his reputation or the belief of his followers that he was the Messiah, and so on, his crucifixion and the aftermath of that. But then we can also look to internal clues of the authenticity of the gospel narratives. So things like events that are multiply attested within the New Testament sources, because as we've said earlier, the New Testament isn't one source, it's probably at least 6 different sources. And so when you have events that are attested by several of those sources, that's very good evidence. But also there's this kind of thematic multiple attestation, which the scholar Dale Allison has talked about a lot, where you have maybe lots of different stories, but they may not individually be multiply attested, but when you take all of these stories, especially if they're occurring across multiple New Testament sources, and they all have the same kind of theme, for instance, that Jesus reached out to the marginalized, then that gives us a very high degree of confidence that that theme was a real aspect of Jesus's ministry. And then we also talk about things like what Lydia and Timothy McGrew have discussed recently, undesigned coincidences. It's sort of instances where you get different sources with, if you will, like 2 pieces of a puzzle that seem to fit together really nicely, but in a way that doesn't look like it's been sort of deliberately engineered by the gospel authors, and other things like that.
Now, well, first of all, Max, I know that you've got to run. Did Calum, did you want to finish up for him? Or did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I guess we do add a bit more in that, yeah.
Cool. All right, thanks so much, Cameron.
Yeah, Max, it was great to meet you. I'm sure that we'll talk more. I know that we were just all business, but it was great to meet you, and it was a fun conversation.
Cool. All right, speak soon. Bye.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's kind of the main structure of the book. So it has these kind of 4 levels. The world is real, the characters are real, the main events of the story are real, and then the extra details are real. And then kind of either side of that, we have just kind of some front matter and some back matter. The front talks about kind of the philosophy of history, general standards for ancient history, how we can approach the Gospels, how can we look at them as historians. And it's quite introductory, so that anyone can kind of pick it up and read it. And then at the end of the book, we talk about other kind of things and kind of the implications. So the front talks about kind of extra kind of philosophy and main considerations and a few objections like contradictions or how do we know what should be in the Bible. And then at the end, we look at, well, okay, suppose the Bible is reliable. Where do we go from that? And then we basically just build on the two kind of main arguments for Christianity that we see from kind of history, which would be kind of the classic trilemma from C.S. Lewis, whether Jesus is Lord, liar, or lunatic, or mad, bad, or God. And we give not just the general reliability of the Gospels, but we give the evidence for particular claims that Jesus made and just talk about the possible explanations for that, whether it could be Jesus lying or Jesus being psychotic, or maybe Jesus being sincerely misled about that, and make the case that looking at the implausibility of those other alternatives should really get us to think maybe Jesus is the person through whom God has revealed himself. And then we just go through basically all the evidence we talked about today, the evidence for the resurrection, and go through the alternative theories for that, and say, when you put all of this together and you look at how good the evidence is for Jesus's claims about himself and the weaknesses of the other explanations of that, when you look at the evidence for the resurrection and the weaknesses of the other explanations for that, and then when you compare that with the Christian story, and we give a little bit about the Christian story, we say this is about God entering the world. How could God enter the world? When could God enter the world? And how would he do it? And why would he do it? There's all these coincidences in the Jesus story, coincidences of good evidence and of the claims he made and of the things he did, that suggest that if God was going to reveal to himself to humans, as we might expect God to do if he really cares, it seems like God has left a fingerprint in the world, and the Jesus story just seems to match up to that fingerprint far better than anyone else in human history. And the evidence we give at the end of the book tries to make that connection and tries to say, if there is a God, which we don't think is that crazy, we think there's good evidence for it, and actually a lot of people are still inclined to believe in some kind of God. If there's a God, and if he cares about us and wants us to know him, which again is not crazy and not very outlandish, how would he do it? And it basically makes the case that the best candidate by far for God revealing himself and allowing us to know him is Jesus. And so we argue for that for the rest of the book.
This sounds like an incredibly comprehensive book on the resurrection. I mean, that's what it sounds like to me. And when you were both describing it, would you agree with that? That it's just like a really comprehensive kind of overview of all of the evidence in support of it?
Sort of. So we're still planning exactly how to release it. So we've got a few different kind of ways of doing it. So the main bulk of the book is actually on the general reliability of the New Testament. And in a sense, the resurrection bit was an afterthought that we thought we should add in just for completeness. So it might be that we do the resurrection in more detail in a later book, because this one's mainly about the general evidence for the reliability of the New Testament. But we're deciding how exactly to release it. We're wanting to do a kind of 200 to 300 page, reasonably accessible book, but we also want to do a book that is extra accessible and much shorter, that can be given out for free just as an evangelism aid, that just covers some of the main bits of evidence and gives people a really visual and good, easily structured idea of the historical evidence for Christianity. And then on the other end of the spectrum from that, we're hoping to do what's essentially a complete comprehensive database of New Testament history, which is going to be a resource that we're hoping to make just widely available, that will have scholarly input, and we'll just go into absolutely as much detail as we can with all the academic work done behind it, basically looking at every passage in the Gospels, everything in the New Testament, and making a kind of overall convincing kind of structure that will be online, that will be released through software, that means people can just access the entirety of the evidence that they could never do through a book. It will be something that will be online because it's so comprehensive and something that will hopefully be of aid to scholars, even in the sense of allowing them to draw all the evidence together in a way that a book never could, such that you end up with the most comprehensive kind of case for the reliability of the Gospels that you could possibly get.
Well, as you guys start to release all this content, it sounds incredible. But as you start to release it, maybe we'll have to bring you back on to do more podcast episodes every step of the way.
Yeah, that'd be great. We'd love to talk about it. And yeah, we're hoping at least the first stage of it should be, the first thing we release will be out this year, I'm pretty sure. So definitely look out for that, and we can do something around that time.
Awesome. Well, we're going to go ahead and close out this episode or the series on the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. It's been a lot of fun. We went through a whole lot of evidence, actually a lot of interesting side points too, like talking about whether or not in 1 Corinthians 15, we're dealing with a spiritual resurrection or a bodily resurrection. Points like that aren't discussed enough, and I'm glad that we were able to in this podcast series. Well, anyways, if you want to learn more about what we're doing, I always mention go to the website, capturingchristianity.com. You can learn everything that we're doing there. Follow us on all our social media, and we'll see you guys next time. All right.